Good evening. Tonight I've prepared a compilation of terrifying true stories. Be sure to like and subscribe to help support the channel. Now let's begin the stories. The first story, The Sounds Below. When my college friend Marcus asked me to house-sit his inherited Victorian home for 2 weeks while he traveled overseas for work, I thought it would be a peaceful retreat from my cramped city apartment. The house sat on 3 acres of wooded land about 40 minutes outside town, a sprawling 3-story structure with bay windows, wrap-around porches, and the kind of architectural character you don't find in modern homes. Marcus had been renovating it slowly since his grandmother passed, and he assured me that despite its age, everything was in working order. He handed me the keys with a grateful smile, mentioning only that the basement door sometimes stuck, and I shouldn't worry about any settling noises old houses tend to make. The first few days passed without incident. I established a routine of working on my laptop in the sunny kitchen during the day, taking walks through the surrounding woods in the afternoon, and reading in the comfortable living room each evening. The house felt peaceful, almost protective, with its thick walls and solid construction buffering the outside world. I found myself sleeping better than I had in months, lulled by the gentle creaking of aged timber and the whisper of wind through the eaves. It wasn't until the 4th night that I first heard something that didn't quite fit the pattern of typical house sounds I'd grown accustomed to. I was lying in the guest bedroom on the 2nd floor, halfway between sleep and wakefulness, when a soft thudding sound drifted up from somewhere below. At first I assumed it was the old heating system cycling on, but the sound had a rhythmic quality that seemed almost deliberate. Thud, pause, like someone dropping a heavy book repeatedly. I listened for several minutes, but the sound faded, and I convinced myself it was just the house settling or perhaps a tree branch knocking against the foundation in the wind. Old houses, I reminded myself, have their own language of sounds that seem mysterious until you learn to interpret them. The next morning, I mentioned the sound to Marcus during our scheduled check-in call. He laughed and said the house was full of quirky noises, explaining that his grandmother used to joke about having friendly ghosts who rearranged things when no one was looking. He told me not to worry, and that he'd had similar experiences during his childhood visits, hearing footsteps and bumping sounds that always turned out to be nothing more than the house's natural acoustics playing tricks. His casual dismissal put me at ease, and I went about my day without giving the matter much more thought. But the sounds continued, becoming more frequent and seemingly more purposeful. During my 2nd week, I began to notice them during daylight hours as well. While working at the kitchen table, I would hear what sounded like muffled movement directly beneath me, as if someone were walking around in heavy socks or slippers. When I mentioned this to my girlfriend during a video call, she suggested that small animals might have gotten into the basement and were making nests among stored furniture or boxes. This explanation made perfect sense, and I felt somewhat embarrassed for not considering it earlier. Determined to solve the mystery and possibly help Marcus with a pest problem, I decided to investigate the basement myself. I had avoided going down there previously, partly because Marcus hadn't given me any reason to venture into that part of the house, and partly because the basement door was located in a narrow hallway that felt somehow unwelcoming. True to Marcus's warning, the door handle resisted my efforts, and I had to put my shoulder against the frame and twist hard before it finally gave way with a sharp crack. The basement was larger than I expected, stretching beneath what seemed to be the entire footprint of the house. A single hanging light bulb illuminated the immediate area around the stairs, but much of the space disappeared into shadows. I could make out the hulking shapes of a furnace, water heater, and several pieces of covered furniture that must have belonged to Marcus's grandmother. The air smelled of concrete dust, old wood, and something else I couldn't immediately identify, something vaguely organic and lived in. I had brought a flashlight, and as I swept the beam across the far corners of the basement, I noticed something that made me pause. In the furthest corner, partially hidden behind a stack of cardboard boxes, was what appeared to be a makeshift living area. I could see the edge of a sleeping bag, some folded clothes, and what looked like empty food containers. My heart began beating faster as I approached, the flashlight beam revealing more details with each step. Someone had created a surprisingly organized campsite in the corner of Marcus's basement. The sleeping bag was military style, olive green and well-maintained. Nearby sat a small camping stove, several gallon jugs of water, and a neat stack of canned goods. A milk crate served as a makeshift table, holding a few paperback books, a battery-powered radio, and a small notebook. Everything was arranged with the kind of careful precision that suggested this wasn't a temporary arrangement, but rather someone's established living quarters. My hands trembled as I picked up the notebook, though I knew I was probably violating someone's privacy. The entries were written in neat handwriting and dated going back nearly 3 months. The person who signed each entry with the initials DM wrote mostly about daily observations, weather patterns, and what appeared to be a schedule for moving around the house during certain hours. Several entries mentioned waiting for the right time and referred to her house as if the basement dweller had some legitimate claim to the property. As I read further, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The entries described intimate knowledge of the house's routines and inhabitants. There were references to Marcus's renovation schedule, his work patterns, and even his grandmother's final months before she passed. DM had apparently been living in the basement for much longer than the dated entries suggested, possibly even before the grandmother died. Some entries mentioned bringing food upstairs when the house was empty, and described detailed knowledge of which floorboards creaked and which areas of the house were safest to move through undetected. The most unsettling discovery came when I found entries from the past week that described my own activities with uncomfortable accuracy. DM had noted my arrival time, my daily routines, my phone conversations, and even my sleeping patterns. One entry mentioned that I seemed like a temporary disruption, and that patience would be required until normal routine could resume. The clinical tone of these observations sent chills through me, and I realized I had been watched and studied by someone who considered themselves a permanent resident of this house. I carefully replaced the notebook and backed away from the living area, my mind racing with questions and fears. Who was DM, and how long had they been living here without Marcus's knowledge? Were they still somewhere in the basement, possibly watching me at this very moment? I swept my flashlight across every shadow and corner, but the basement seemed empty except for the evidence of long-term habitation. The organic smell I had noticed earlier now seemed more ominous, the scent of someone who had been living in this confined space for an extended period. I climbed the stairs as quietly as possible and closed the basement door, though I now realized the sticking mechanism might have been deliberately sabotaged to prevent casual exploration. My hands shook as I tried to decide what to do next. Should I call Marcus immediately, or should I contact the police first? The notebook entries suggested that DM had developed an emotional attachment to the house and might react unpredictably to being discovered or evicted. There was also the disturbing possibility that this person might currently be somewhere else in the house, hiding in areas I hadn't yet explored. I spent the remainder of that day in a state of hypervigilance, listening for any sounds that might indicate movement below. Every creak of the floorboards, every settling noise, every whisper of wind through the walls now carried the potential threat of human presence. As evening approached, I realized I couldn't spend another night in the house without knowing whether DM had returned to their basement hideaway. The thought of sleeping while someone moved quietly through the rooms below was absolutely terrifying. When I finally worked up the courage to call Marcus, his reaction was surprisingly calm initially, but I could hear the growing concern in his voice as I described what I had found. He admitted that his grandmother had occasionally mentioned hearing sounds in the house during her final months, but the family had attributed those reports to her declining health and possible confusion. Now we both realized that she might have been aware of her unwelcome houseguest long before anyone else suspected the truth. Marcus cut his trip short and returned the next day with a locksmith and 2 police officers, but when they searched the basement, DM and all evidence of their residence had vanished completely. The corner where I had discovered the makeshift living area was empty, except for dust patterns on the concrete floor that suggested furniture had indeed been placed there recently. No one questioned my account, but without physical evidence, there was little the police could do beyond filing a report and recommending enhanced security measures. I never learned who DM was or where they went after being discovered, but Marcus installed a security system and changed all the locks before moving into his grandmother's house permanently. Sometimes I wonder if DM... Next story, the route home. I still check my Uber app obsessively before getting into any rideshare vehicle now, screenshotting the license plate, the driver's photo, even their star rating. My friends think I'm paranoid, but they weren't there that night 3 months ago when my routine ride home from downtown turned into something I'm still trying to understand. The memory sits in my chest like a cold stone, and every time I see those familiar headlights pulling up to the curb, I feel that same flutter of anxiety, wondering if this driver will take me where I actually need to go. It was a Thursday evening in late October. Nothing special about the day except that I'd stayed later than usual at the marketing firm where I work, trying to finish a presentation for Friday morning. The office building had mostly emptied out by the time I gathered my things, and downtown had that hollow feeling it gets after business hours, when the suits disappear and leave behind only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional homeless person pushing a shopping cart down the sidewalk. I requested my ride from the lobby, watching through the glass doors as a silver Honda Civic with the right license plate pulled up exactly on time. The driver was a middle-aged man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, exactly matching his photo in the app. He wore a navy blue cardigan that looked hand-knitted, the kind of sweater a grandmother might make, and when he smiled at me in the rearview mirror, I noticed he had very white teeth that seemed too perfect, too uniform. His voice was soft and pleasant when he confirmed my destination, a small apartment complex about 15 minutes north of downtown, and he asked about my day in that polite but distant way that Uber drivers often do when they're trying to be friendly, without being intrusive. Sarah Chen, that was my name on the app, and he said it correctly without me having to correct the pronunciation like most drivers do. We made small talk as he navigated through the familiar streets, past the coffee shop where I sometimes grabbed breakfast, past the dry cleaner I'd been meaning to visit for weeks. Everything felt completely normal, and I remember thinking how refreshing it was to have a driver who didn't blast music or try to convert me to his particular worldview, or attempt to offer me snacks from a questionable container. Just a quiet, professional ride home after a long day, exactly what I needed. But somewhere around the 10-minute mark, I noticed we weren't taking the usual route. Instead of heading straight up Madison Avenue like every other driver had done dozens of times before, he'd turned left onto a street I didn't recognize, though I couldn't quite pinpoint when the deviation had started. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, thinking maybe there was construction or an accident that required a detour. But my screen showed we were still following the recommended route, even though I was certain we were driving through an area I'd never seen before. The buildings here were different, older and more run-down than the gentrified neighborhoods between downtown and my apartment. Empty lots stretched between structures that looked like they hadn't been occupied in years, their windows dark and sometimes boarded up, weeds growing through cracks in the sidewalk. Streetlights were fewer and farther between, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I told myself this was just an alternate route. The GPS system sometimes updated their recommendations based on traffic patterns I couldn't see, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the geography we were passing through. When I asked the driver about the route, he glanced at me in the mirror with those two white teeth visible in another smile and said we were taking a scenic path tonight, that he thought I might enjoy seeing a different part of the city. His voice maintained that same pleasant conversational tone, but there was something underneath it now. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the comfortable temperature in the car. I tried to keep my voice casual when I told him I was actually in a hurry and would prefer the direct route, but he just nodded and said we'd be there soon, making no move to change direction. The urban landscape was giving way to something that didn't make sense. Stretches of undeveloped land that seemed impossible to exist so close to downtown. Trees began appearing along the roadside. First, just a few scattered specimens, then small clusters. Then what looked like the beginning of actual forest. I checked my phone again, but the GPS still showed us on track. The blue line indicating we were exactly where we should be, even though my eyes were telling me we were driving into wilderness that couldn't possibly exist within the city limits. I tried calling my roommate, thinking I could casually mention where we were and create some kind of record of our location, but my phone showed no signal despite having had full bars just minutes earlier. The driver noticed me looking at my screen and commented that reception could be spotty in this area, something about the topography interfering with the cell towers. His explanation sounded reasonable enough, but everything about this situation was starting to feel like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together into any coherent picture. The trees were getting thicker now, pressing closer to the road on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered out most of the moonlight. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead, and I realized I couldn't see any other cars. No traffic in either direction, no signs of civilization except for this single ribbon of asphalt, winding deeper into the woods. When I asked again about our destination, working harder now to keep the growing fear out of my voice, the driver said we were taking the long way, that he wanted to show me something special before delivering me home. That phrase, delivering me home, struck me as oddly formal. The kind of language you might use for a package rather than a person, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I reached for the door handle, some instinctive part of my brain suggesting that whatever was happening here, I needed to be ready to exit the vehicle quickly. But when I pulled the handle, the door didn't budge. I tried again, more forcefully this time, but the mechanism seemed to be locked or disabled somehow. The driver noticed my attempts and explained in that same calm, pleasant voice that the child safety locks were engaged for my protection, that these roads could be dangerous and he didn't want me to accidentally open the door while we were moving. But we weren't moving that fast, maybe 25 miles per hour along this winding forest road. And I was 28 years old, hardly in need of child safety features. I asked him directly to unlock the doors, and he promised he would as soon as we reached our destination, just a little further up ahead. But we kept driving, deeper into woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, occasionally passing what looked like hiking trail markers or small wooden signs that were too dark for me to read. The driver had stopped making conversation, focusing intently on the road ahead, and in the silence I could hear sounds from outside that didn't seem right for a forest. Mechanical noises that might have been machinery or vehicles but distorted somehow, filtered through the trees until they became something unidentifiable and unsettling. My phone was completely dead now, not just lacking signal but powered off entirely despite showing a full charge when I'd gotten into the car. The dashboard clock read 11:47, though that seemed impossible since I'd left the office around 9:30 and the drive should have taken 15 minutes. Either we'd been driving for over 2 hours or time itself had become unreliable, and neither possibility offered any comfort. The fuel gauge showed nearly full, suggesting we could continue this journey indefinitely if the driver chose to do so. Then, just as suddenly as we'd entered the forest, we emerged into familiar territory, turning onto Madison Avenue just a few blocks from my apartment complex. as if the previous hour had been compressed into a single impossible moment. The driver pulled up to my building exactly where every other Uber had dropped me off, engaging the parking brake and turning to smile at me with those perfectly white teeth. The door locks clicked open with an audible sound, and his pleasant voice told me we'd arrived at my destination, thanking me for choosing Uber tonight. I stumbled out of the car on legs that felt unsteady, looking back through the passenger window at this man who had just driven me through a landscape that couldn't exist, but he was already pulling away from the curb with a friendly wave goodbye. The trip showed up on my app as a perfectly normal 14-minute ride along the standard route, charged to my credit card at the usual rate, complete with an automated request to rate my driver's performance. But my hands were shaking too hard to hold my phone steady, and all I could do was stand on the sidewalk watching those taillights disappear into traffic that materialized from nowhere, carrying him back toward whatever impossible geography he'd emerged from to collect unsuspecting passengers in the night. Next story, the punctual visitor. It started 3 weeks after I moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, a detail I would later realize was far more significant than I initially understood. The house had belonged to my great-aunt Millicent, a woman I barely remembered from childhood visits filled with the scent of lavender and the persistent tick of grandfather clocks. When she passed, leaving the house to me in her will, I saw it as a blessing, a chance to escape my cramped city apartment and start fresh in a place with character and history. The real estate agent had been surprisingly eager to hand over the keys, mentioning only in passing that the house had been empty for nearly 2 years since Millicent's death, as if that explained the faint mustiness that clung to the rooms despite the professional cleaning service I'd hired. The first few weeks were blissful in their solitude. I spent my days arranging furniture, hanging pictures, and slowly making the space my own. The house responded well to human presence again, its hardwood floors gleaming under fresh polish and its vintage wallpaper seeming to brighten as natural light filled rooms that had remained shuttered for too long. I particularly loved the front parlor with its bay windows and the way afternoon sunlight created dancing patterns on the Persian rug. Even the neighbors seemed welcoming, though I noticed they had a peculiar habit of hurrying past the house after sunset, their eyes carefully averted from my windows. The knocking began on a Tuesday night in late October, precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning. I remember the time exactly because the antique clock in the hallway had just finished chiming the hour when 3 measured knocks echoed through the house. They weren't urgent or frantic, but deliberate and patient, the kind of knocking that suggested the visitor was prepared to wait as long as necessary. I stumbled from bed, assuming it was some kind of emergency, perhaps a neighbor needing help or someone whose car had broken down on the quiet residential street. The porch light illuminated an empty front step, and when I opened the door, only the cool autumn air greeted me, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else I couldn't quite identify, something that reminded me of old books and forgotten spaces. I checked the side yards and even walked around to the back of the house, my bare feet growing cold on the dewy grass. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints marked the soft earth beneath my windows, and the street remained as silent as a held breath. I attributed it to settling sounds. Old houses were notorious for their creaks and groans, and perhaps the changing temperature had caused some structural shift that mimicked knocking. It seemed like a reasonable explanation, one that allowed me to return to bed with only a slight uneasiness that faded as sleep reclaimed me. But the knocking returned the next night at exactly the same time. 3 measured knocks that seemed to resonate through the very bones of the house. This time I was more prepared, keeping a flashlight by my bedside and moving more quietly through the darkened rooms. I positioned myself by the front window before opening the door, watching for any sign of movement, any shadow that might explain the sound. The porch remained empty, the street bathed in the pale glow of a single street lamp that cast long, wavering shadows from the oak trees that lined the block. The knocking had been so clear, so unmistakably the sound of knuckles against wood, that I found myself questioning my own senses. As the nights progressed, the pattern never varied. 2 o'clock arrived with the precision of clockwork, followed immediately by 3 knocks, each one identical in volume and spacing to the last. I began to anticipate it, lying awake in bed and watching the clock's hands creep toward the appointed hour. The waiting became almost worse than the knocking itself, a tension that built in my chest as the minutes ticked away. I tried staying in different rooms, thinking that perhaps the sound was traveling through the house in a way that made me misinterpret its origin. But no matter where I positioned myself, the knocking always seemed to come from the front door, always carried that same patient, almost polite quality that made it somehow more unsettling than any desperate pounding would have been. Sleep became elusive as the nightly visitations continued. I found myself exhausted during the day, jumping at unexpected sounds and constantly glancing at clocks as evening approached. My work suffered as concentration became increasingly difficult, and I began researching the house's history with a desperation I was reluctant to acknowledge. The local historical society had limited records, but what I found painted a picture of a house that had seen more than its share of solitary occupants. Great-Aunt Millicent had lived alone for nearly 40 years after her husband's death, and before her, a succession of elderly residents had called the Victorian home, each seeming to retreat from the world as the years passed. The librarian, a kindly woman with silver hair and knowing eyes, mentioned that she remembered Millicent well. She spoke of how my great-aunt had become increasingly reclusive in her final years, rarely venturing out except for essential errands and often appearing tired and distracted when she did. There had been rumors, the librarian admitted with some reluctance, that Millicent had complained to neighbors about nighttime disturbances, though no one had taken the claim seriously, given her advanced age and growing eccentricity. The parallels to my own experience sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. I decided to install a security camera, a small device that would record the front porch and hopefully provide some rational explanation for the nightly phenomenon. The camera arrived on a Thursday, and I spent the afternoon positioning it to capture the entire porch area, testing its night vision capabilities and ensuring it would record any movement, no matter how subtle. That evening, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation, convinced that technology would finally solve the mystery that had been robbing me of sleep and peace of mind. The knocking came at 2 o'clock as always, 3 measured raps that echoed through the house with their familiar patient rhythm. I forced myself to remain in bed, knowing the camera would capture whatever was causing the sound. But the temptation proved too strong, and I found myself creeping to the window anyway, peering through the curtains at the empty porch below. The streetlight continued its faithful vigil, casting the same patterns of light and shadow that had become as familiar to me as the knocking itself. Morning brought the moment of truth as I eagerly reviewed the camera footage on my laptop. The timestamp showed the hours passing in fast forward, the porch remaining undisturbed under the watchful electronic eye. At exactly 1:59:47, I slowed the playback to normal speed, my heart racing with anticipation. 2 o'clock arrived with digital precision, and the timestamp continued its march forward. 2:01, 2:02, 2:03. Nothing appeared on the screen, no figure approaching the door, no movement of any kind that could account for the knocking I had heard as clearly as every other night. The recording showed only empty space, yet I knew with absolute certainty that the knocking had occurred. I could remember hearing it, remember the way it had resonated through the house, remember my familiar surge of reluctant hope that this time I might glimpse whatever was creating the sound. The disconnect between the recorded evidence and my lived experience created a vertigo-like sensation, as if the ground beneath my understanding of reality had shifted slightly but perceptibly. Weeks passed, and the nightly visits continued with their clockwork regularity. I grew almost accustomed to them, in the way one adapts to chronic pain or persistent noise. The knocking became part of my routine, a strange bookmark that divided each day from the next. I began to wonder if this was how Great Aunt Millicent had felt, if the patient knocking had gradually worn down her resistance until she simply accepted it as another feature of the house, no different from creaking floorboards or drafty windows. But on the night before Halloween, something changed. The knocking came at 2 o'clock as expected, but this time it was followed by a sound I had never heard before. The soft scrape of footsteps moving away from the door, fading gradually as if someone was finally departing after weeks of faithful visitation. I waited for the footsteps to return, for the familiar pattern to reassert itself. But the house settled into a silence that felt different from all the nights before, deeper and more complete. The next morning I found a single envelope on my doorstep, yellowed with age and bearing my name in spidery handwriting I recognized from old birthday cards. Inside was a brief note from Great Aunt Millicent, dated just days before her death. "The visitor will find you when you're ready to listen. Don't be afraid to let them in." As I stood on the porch holding the impossible letter, I realized that the knocking had never been trying to get inside at all. It had been trying to teach me that some doors, once opened, lead to places where time moves differently, and the boundaries between yesterday and tomorrow become wonderfully, terrifyingly thin. Next story. The Watchers in the Feed. I never thought accepting a simple overnight security job would change everything I thought I knew about reality. My name is Marcus, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 weeks ago at the Meridian Corporate Complex, a gleaming 20-story office building downtown that houses various tech companies and consulting firms. The pay was decent for what seemed like easy work. Sitting in a small security office watching monitors while the night janitors made their rounds and the building settled into its after-hours quiet. The security supervisor, Mrs. Chen, had been apologetic about the short notice. Their regular night guard had quit without explanation, leaving only a hastily scrawled resignation note that simply said he couldn't do it anymore. She walked me through the basic procedures during my brief afternoon orientation, showing me the bank of 12 monitors that cycled through feeds from 43 cameras positioned throughout the building. The system was state-of-the-art, with crystal-clear digital feeds and motion detection capabilities that would highlight any unusual activity, with a soft chime and a red border around the affected screen. The job seemed straightforward enough. Monitor the feeds, log any unusual activity, and call the police if anything genuinely concerning occurred. Mrs. Chen mentioned that the building had been experiencing some minor incidents lately. Nothing serious, just doors found unlocked in the morning, and occasional reports from the cleaning crew about feeling watched. She attributed it to stress and the usual paranoia that comes with working in an empty building at night. But her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. My first few hours passed uneventfully. I watched the janitorial crew move efficiently through their routine, their movements tracked by the cameras as they progressed from floor to floor. The building had an almost meditative quality in its emptiness, with only the soft hum of ventilation systems and the occasional ping of cooling metal to break the silence. I found myself falling into a comfortable rhythm, making my hourly log entries and occasionally switching between camera feeds to keep myself alert and engaged. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I first noticed something odd. Camera 7, which monitored the 15th floor hallway, showed what appeared to be a person standing motionless near the elevator bank. The figure was completely still, facing away from the camera, and seemed to be wearing dark clothing that made it difficult to make out any details. I checked my log and confirmed that the cleaning crew had finished that floor over an hour ago, so there shouldn't have been anyone there. I tried calling out on the building's intercom system, identifying myself as security, and asking if anyone needed assistance. There was no response, and when I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. I cycled through the adjacent cameras trying to track where the person might have gone, but there was no sign of them anywhere. The elevator hadn't moved, and the stairwell cameras showed nothing unusual. It was as if the figure had simply vanished. Over the next hour, similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. A shadow would appear at the edge of camera 9's field of view, only to disappear when I switched to a different angle to get a better look. Camera 12 would show what looked like someone walking quickly past a conference room window, but the hallway camera for that area revealed nothing. Each time I tried to investigate further or get a clearer view, whatever I was seeing would vanish, leaving me to question whether I was seeing things that weren't really there. The truly unsettling part wasn't just the appearances themselves, but the way they seemed to avoid direct observation. It was as if these figures were aware of the camera system and were deliberately staying just outside clear view, creating glimpses and suggestions rather than allowing themselves to be fully seen. They moved with purpose and intelligence, always managing to slip away before I could get solid evidence of their presence. Around 4 o'clock, the activity escalated dramatically. Instead of single figures appearing briefly on individual cameras, I began seeing coordinated movement across multiple feeds. Shadows would move from one camera's range directly into another's, creating a pattern of motion that suggested a group of individuals moving through the building. With detailed knowledge of the camera positions and blind spots, the motion detection system was triggering constantly now. But whenever I focused on a specific monitor that was alerting, the movement would cease immediately. The most disturbing realization came when I started mapping their movements on the building directory. They weren't moving randomly or simply exploring the empty offices. Instead, they were following a precise pattern, visiting specific locations in what appeared to be a carefully planned sequence. They moved through the accounting firm on the 8th floor, spent considerable time in the software development company on the 12th floor, and made multiple visits to the executive offices on the 18th floor. What made this pattern truly chilling was that they seemed to be conducting surveillance of their own. They would position themselves near important offices, server rooms, and areas where sensitive information would likely be stored during business hours. But this wasn't ordinary corporate espionage. The figures moved too smoothly, appeared and disappeared too easily, and demonstrated an almost supernatural awareness of being observed that made conventional explanations feel inadequate. As dawn approached, I began to understand why my predecessor had quit so abruptly. The figures weren't just avoiding the cameras. They were studying them. I started noticing subtle changes in their behavior that suggested they were learning from each observation. They began anticipating which cameras I would check next, moving away from areas just before I could focus on them, and coordinating their activities with a precision that seemed impossible for normal intruders. The final incident occurred just as the first employees were beginning to arrive for the early shift. Camera 15, which monitored the main lobby, showed a businessman in an expensive suit entering through the front doors, checking his watch, and heading toward the elevators. Nothing unusual about that, except that I could see the same man simultaneously on camera 23, standing motionless in a 14th floor corridor, staring directly into the camera with an expression of calm awareness that sent ice through my veins. I blinked and looked again, certain I was experiencing some kind of fatigue-induced hallucination, but both figures remained visible on their respective monitors. The man in the lobby continued his normal morning routine, while his identical counterpart on the 14th floor maintained his unsettling vigil. They moved with slight variations in timing like a delayed reflection, but were otherwise perfect duplicates of each other performing different actions simultaneously. When Mrs. Chen arrived for her morning shift, I tried to explain what I had witnessed, but the words sounded incredible even to me. She listened patiently, occasionally glancing at the monitors, which now showed nothing more than the normal bustle of employees beginning their workday. I showed her my detailed logs of the unusual activity. But in the morning light, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a building coming to life, my carefully documented observations seemed like the paranoid fantasies of an overwrought mind. She was kind but clearly skeptical, suggesting that the combination of an unfamiliar environment, the isolation of night shift work, and the power of suggestion from the previous guard's sudden departure had likely contributed to what I believed I had seen. The building's management had been dealing with false alarms and anxious reports from night staff for months, she explained gently, and they had found that most incidents could be attributed to natural causes and overactive imaginations. I wanted to accept her rational explanation, to dismiss my experiences as products of stress and suggestion, but something in her eyes suggested she knew more than she was admitting. When I asked directly about the previous guard's sudden departure, her expression became guarded, and she mentioned only that he had been under considerable strain and had made some unusual claims about the building before deciding the work wasn't suitable for him. 3 weeks have passed since that night, and I've tried to return to my normal routine, but questions continue to haunt me. I find myself researching the building's history, looking for explanations that might account for what I witnessed. The Meridian complex was built on the site of an older structure, and there are gaps in the public records that make me wonder what stood there before. More troubling are the patterns I've begun noticing in my daily life. Moments where I catch glimpses of familiar faces in impossible locations, situations that echo the doubled figures I saw on those security monitors. Sometimes I wonder if whatever exists in that building isn't confined to the Meridian complex at all, but represents something much larger and more pervasive. Perhaps what I witnessed that night was just one small window into a reality that runs parallel to our own, populated by watchers who observe us as carefully as we try to monitor them, always staying just outside our direct perception while conducting their own mysterious surveillance of our supposedly secure and private world. Next story, The Voice Through the Walls. Harold Brennan lived in the house next to mine for exactly 17 years, 4 months, and 12 days. I know this because he told me the precise count every time we spoke over the chain-link fence that separated our modest backyards. Harold was the kind of neighbor who kept meticulous records of everything. When he planted his tomatoes, how many inches of rain fell each month, the exact number of cars that passed down our quiet street each day. He had small, careful handwriting that he used to log these details in composition notebooks, the kind school children use, and I'd often see him sitting on his back steps in the early morning, pencil poised, watching the world with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. The morning I realized Harold was gone didn't feel particularly significant at first. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the maple tree that straddled our property line had begun dropping its leaves in earnest, creating a rustling carpet that muffled footsteps and made everything sound slightly muted. I had grown accustomed to hearing Harold's morning routine through the thin walls of our Depression-era houses. The whistle of his kettle at precisely 6:15, the creak of his back door as he stepped outside to check his small garden, the gentle thud of his composition book closing as he finished his daily observations. That Tuesday morning, the silence felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Days passed without any sign of Harold, and eventually, his sister Margaret came from 3 states away to pack up his belongings. She was a brisk, efficient woman who spoke in short, clipped sentences and seemed eager to finish her task and return to her own life. When I asked her what had happened to Harold, she paused in her sorting of his meticulously organized kitchen and gave me a look that suggested she found the question somehow inappropriate. Harold had simply left, she explained, though she couldn't say where he'd gone or why he'd decided to abandon his house so suddenly. There had been no note, no phone call, no indication that he was planning to leave. One day he was there and the next day he wasn't. as if he had simply stepped out of his life like walking through a doorway. The house remained empty through the winter months, and I found myself missing the small sounds that had marked Harold's presence more than I had expected. Our neighborhood was quiet under the best of circumstances, populated mostly by elderly residents and young couples just starting out. But Harold's absence created a particular kind of silence that felt heavier than mere quiet. It was during one of those long, cold nights in February that I first heard my name being called from the direction of his house. The voice was unmistakably Harold's, that careful, measured tone he used when he wanted to discuss some minor matter concerning our shared fence, or to point out an interesting bird he'd spotted in the maple tree. At first I assumed I was dreaming, or perhaps remembering conversations from when he still lived next door. The human mind, I told myself, has a way of filling empty spaces with familiar sounds, and it seemed natural that I might imagine hearing his voice during those quiet hours when sleep and waking blur together. I investigated the first few times, walking to my back window and peering out into the darkness, but Harold's house remained obviously empty, its windows dark and lawn growing increasingly untended. As the weeks passed, the voice became more persistent and more clearly defined. It would come always between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, cutting through the winter silence with startling clarity. "Robert," it would call, pronouncing my name with the same careful articulation Harold had always used, as if he were tasting each syllable before releasing it into the air. "Robert, could you come out here for a moment?" Sometimes the request was slightly different. "Robert, I need to show you something in the garden," or "Robert, have you seen my notebook?" But the tone remained consistently polite and familiar, exactly as Harold had sounded during our countless brief conversations over the years. I began keeping a log of these incidents, partly because Harold's methodical approach to recording daily events had influenced me more than I cared to admit, and partly because I hoped that writing down the details might help me understand what was happening. The voice always seemed to originate from Harold's backyard, specifically from the area near his small vegetable garden, where he had spent so many mornings making his careful observations. It never sounded distressed or urgent, maintaining instead the same courteous, slightly formal quality that had characterized all of our interactions when he was still living next door. By spring, when the maple tree began showing its first tentative green buds, the voice had become an almost nightly occurrence. I found myself staying awake in anticipation, sitting by my back window with a cup of tea, waiting for Harold to call my name across the growing darkness. There was something oddly comforting about these one-sided conversations, even though they left me feeling unsettled and questioning my own perception. The voice never responded when I called back, never acknowledged my presence when I stood at my window obviously listening, but it continued with the same patient politeness that had made Harold such an unobtrusive neighbor. Margaret returned that spring to check on the house and arrange for some basic maintenance, and I debated whether to tell her about the voice. She seemed like the sort of practical person who would have a reasonable explanation for what I was experiencing, or who might at least be able to provide some information about Harold's state of mind before his departure. When I finally gathered the courage to mention it, she gave me the same look she'd offered when I first asked about Harold's disappearance, a mixture of discomfort and mild disapproval that suggested she found the topic somehow distasteful. Harold had always been prone to unusual behavior, she said, and she wouldn't be surprised if he had found some way to continue being bothersome even after leaving the neighborhood. Her dismissive response troubled me more than her brother's mysterious disappearance, partly because it suggested that Harold's careful, methodical personality might have hidden aspects of his character that I had never recognized. During all those years of brief, polite conversations, had I completely misunderstood the man who lived 15 feet away from my own bedroom? The voice that continued calling my name each night sounded exactly like the Harold I remembered, courteous, slightly formal, interested in small details and minor observations about daily life. If Margaret was right about her brother's capacity for unusual behavior, then perhaps the Harold I thought I knew had been as much a mystery as his sudden disappearance. As summer progressed and the maple tree filled out with dense green foliage, the voice began calling my name earlier in the evening, sometimes just after sunset when the last light was fading from Harold's overgrown garden. I developed the habit of responding aloud, carrying on one-sided conversations across the fence just as we had done when Harold was still visible. I would tell him about changes in the neighborhood, about the weather, about small observations that seemed like the sort of details he would have carefully recorded in his composition notebooks. The voice never acknowledged these contributions, but it seemed to me that the requests became more specific, more focused on particular aspects of his former daily routine. "Robert, did you remember to check the rain gauge?" he might ask, referring to the small instrument he had mounted on a post near our shared fence. "Robert, have the morning glories started climbing the trellis yet?" These questions suggested an ongoing concern with the small details of domestic life, as if Harold were still maintaining his careful records from wherever he had gone. I began checking the rain gauge regularly and monitoring the progress of his abandoned garden, feeling somehow responsible for maintaining the observations that had structured his days for so many years. By autumn, exactly 1 year after Harold's disappearance, his voice had become such a regular part of my evening routine that I no longer found it startling or strange. The house next door remained obviously empty. Margaret had arranged for minimal upkeep but made no effort to sell the property or find new tenants. Yet, Harold's presence felt more real to me than many of my interactions with visible neighbors. When he called my name across the darkness, I felt the same mild sense of social obligation I had experienced during our face-to-face conversations, the comfortable awareness of being part of someone else's carefully ordered world. On the anniversary of that first quiet Tuesday morning when I realized Harold was gone, his voice came just after midnight, earlier than usual, and with a slight variation in tone that made me look up from the book I was reading. "Robert," he called with his familiar, careful pronunciation. "Thank you for keeping track of everything while I was away." The gratitude in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time in a year, it seemed as though he were actually addressing me rather than simply calling my name into the darkness. I sat by my window until dawn, waiting for him to say something more, but the rest of the night passed in perfect silence. Next story, the still warm kitchen. When my exploration group first heard about the abandoned Mercy General Hospital on the outskirts of Millbrook, we knew we had to investigate. The 5 of us had been urban explorers for years, documenting forgotten places across 3 states. But something about this particular location intrigued us more than usual. The hospital had been shuttered for over a decade after a financial scandal, and according to local reports, it had been sitting empty ever since, slowly succumbing to the elements and time. The building stood like a monument to neglect when we arrived that overcast October morning. 7 stories of weathered concrete and broken windows with vines creeping up the eastern wall like grasping fingers. Marcus, our group's photographer, was already snapping pictures before we'd even gotten out of the van. Sarah checked her audio equipment while Jake and Devin reviewed the building's layout on their phones. I served as the group's historian, researching the backgrounds of every location we visited, and Mercy General had a particularly interesting past. Built in 1954, the hospital had served the community faithfully for nearly 60 years before allegations of insurance fraud and patient neglect led to its closure. What made it unusual was how quickly everyone had abandoned it. Unlike most hospital closures, which involve months of transferring patients and equipment, Mercy General had been evacuated within 48 hours. Staff members had reportedly been told to leave immediately, taking only personal belongings. Everything else, medical equipment, furniture, even patient records, had been left behind. The main entrance was sealed with heavy chains and warning signs, but Jake had found reports of an accessible service entrance near the loading docks. We made our way around the building's perimeter, our footsteps echoing off the empty parking lot. The service door was indeed unlocked, hanging slightly ajar as if waiting for us. The hinges groaned as we pushed it open, revealing a dark corridor that stretched into the building's depths. Our flashlight beams cut through the stale air as we entered. The hallway was exactly what we expected from an abandoned hospital: institutional linoleum, faded yellow walls, and that distinctive antiseptic smell that never quite disappears. But there was something else in the air, something that made Sarah wrinkle her nose. It was faint but unmistakable, the aroma of cooking food. Devin laughed it off, suggesting it was probably coming from a nearby restaurant or maybe someone grilling in the neighborhood. But as we ventured deeper into the building, the smell grew stronger. It wasn't the generic scent of food from a distance. It was specific. Onion sautéing, herbs simmering, the rich, warm fragrance of a meal being prepared. We explored the first floor methodically, documenting empty patient rooms and abandoned nursing stations. The hospital had been stripped of most valuable equipment, but smaller items remained scattered throughout: wheelchairs pushed against walls, medical charts yellowing in forgotten corners, even a few stethoscopes hanging from doorknobs. It was a typical abandoned medical facility, frozen in time, except for that persistent cooking smell that seemed to follow us through every corridor. The elevator banks were predictably non-functional, so we located the stairwell and began climbing. Each floor revealed more of the same empty rooms, peeling paint, broken ceiling tiles, and the occasional piece of forgotten medical equipment. But on the fourth floor, something changed. The cooking smell became overwhelming, rich and savory and undeniably close. Marcus stopped in the middle of the hallway and looked around. "Guys, I'm not imagining this, right? That definitely smells like someone's making dinner." We all nodded in agreement. Sarah had even started recording, hoping to capture any sounds that might accompany the mysterious aromas. Following the scent like a trail, we made our way toward what our building schematics indicated was the staff break area. The smell grew stronger with each step, leading us to a set of double doors marked Staff Kitchen and Dining. Jake pushed the doors open, and we stepped into a scene that defied explanation. The kitchen was immaculate. Not just clean, but actively in use. Pots simmered on stovetops that somehow had power, filling the air with steam and the rich scents we'd been tracking. A large soup pot bubbled with what appeared to be vegetable broth, while several pans contained what looked like a complete meal in preparation. Onions and garlic sizzled in one skillet, while another held seasoned potatoes that were perfectly golden brown. The countertops were spotless, as if they'd been scrubbed moments before our arrival. Fresh ingredients were laid out in organized rows: carrots, celery, fresh herbs that looked like they'd just been purchased from a market. A cutting board held perfectly diced vegetables, the knife beside it still bearing traces of their juices. Most unsettling of all, everything was exactly the right temperature. The food was actively cooking, not burnt or overcooked as it would be if abandoned mid-preparation. Devin approached one of the stovetops cautiously, holding his hand above the burner. "It's definitely hot," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell was keeping this impossible scene intact. The electric burners glowed red beneath their pots, and when Sarah tested a light switch, the overhead fluorescence flickered to life, bathing the kitchen in harsh, institutional brightness. We stood there for several minutes trying to process what we were seeing. The rest of the hospital had clearly been without power for years. Dust covered every surface we'd encountered, and most of the windows were broken or boarded up. Yet here, in this fourth-floor kitchen, someone or something was preparing what looked like a meal for a dozen people. Marcus began documenting everything with his camera, the flash reflecting off pristine stainless steel surfaces. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a small television mounted in the corner. It was on, displaying a cooking show with the volume turned low. The program appeared to be current a celebrity chef we all recognized, demonstrating techniques for autumn vegetable dishes. Jake discovered that the kitchen's phone line was active. When he picked up the receiver, he heard a dial tone, something that should have been impossible in a building that had been abandoned for over a decade. More disturbing still, when he checked the recent call log displayed on the phone's small screen, it showed incoming calls from that very morning. Sarah noticed something that made her grab my arm. On the kitchen's bulletin board, among faded announcements and old staff schedules, were fresh additions. New notes written in different handwritings discussing meal planning and inventory needs. One note, dated just 3 days earlier, read, "Need more vegetarian options for Thursday dinner service." Another, from yesterday according to its timestamp, reminded someone named Patricia to remember the dietary restrictions for room 237. Room 237. We checked our building schematic, and it showed that room as a standard patient room on the second floor, the same floor where we'd found several wheelchairs positioned as if recently used, though we dismissed it at the time as coincidence. The most unnerving discovery came when Devin opened the refrigerator. It was fully stocked with fresh food, all of it well within expiration dates, milk that wouldn't expire for another week, fresh produce that looked like it had been delivered that morning, leftovers covered with plastic wrap, labeled with masking tape that read, "Tuesday special" and "Save for night shift." But it was the schedule posted on the refrigerator door that truly unsettled us. It was a meal planning calendar for the current month, filled in with different handwriting styles and colors of ink. Each day showed planned breakfast, lunch, and dinner menus, with notes about special dietary requirements and requests. Today's entry read, "Vegetable soup, herb roasted potatoes, fresh rolls," an exact description of what was currently cooking on the stovetops. We tried to rationalize what we were seeing. Perhaps security guards were using the space. Maybe the building wasn't as abandoned as we'd thought. But none of these explanations held up under scrutiny. The rest of the hospital showed clear signs of decade-long abandonment. No security company would maintain such an elaborate setup in a single room, while leaving the rest of the building to decay. As we continued our investigation, we began hearing sounds from elsewhere in the building. Footsteps in distant corridors, the faint ding of what sounded like elevator bells, despite the elevators being non-functional. Occasional voices, too distant to understand but clearly conversational in tone. Sarah's audio equipment was picking up sounds we couldn't hear with our ears, ambient noise suggesting the building was occupied by dozens of people. When she played back the recordings through her headphones, her face went pale. "It sounds like a functioning hospital," she whispered. Phones ringing, people talking, equipment beeping. But it's all happening just out of our range of hearing. We decided to return to the second floor to investigate room 237. The door was closed, unlike when we'd passed it earlier, and there was a patient chart hanging in the door's holder. The chart was new, filled out in recent dates, documenting care for someone listed only as J. Morrison. Next story, the night shift at Millbrook Elementary. I never thought I'd be grateful for a job cleaning up after hundreds of elementary school children. But when you're 3 months behind on rent and your car's making sounds like a dying animal, you take what you can get. The position at Millbrook Elementary was perfect in its simplicity. Work alone, sweep and mop the hallways, empty the trash, lock up when finished. The pay was decent for night work, and the school district seemed almost eager to fill the position. Looking back now, I understand why they were in such a hurry to find someone new. My supervisor, Mrs. Chen, gave me a quick tour on my first evening. The building felt different after dark, the way all empty places do when they should be full of life. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the corridors, bouncing off lockers and bulletin boards covered in colorful student artwork. She showed me where the cleaning supplies were kept, explained the security system, and handed me a heavy ring of keys that jangled with an almost musical quality in the silence. "You'll mostly be working the main hallway and the classrooms on the first floor," she explained, her voice carrying an odd note of caution. "The second floor is, well, it's mostly storage now. You don't really need to worry about up there." When I asked why, she paused for a long moment, adjusting her glasses. "The building's old. Sometimes the heating system makes strange noises upstairs. We don't want to disturb the neighbors with unnecessary activity." It was a reasonable explanation, I thought at the time. The first few weeks passed without incident. I developed a routine. Arrive at 10 p.m., start with the kindergarten wing, work my way through the primary grades, then tackle the main hallway. The building had its personality, as old buildings do. Pipes creaked, the ancient radiators clanked to life at irregular intervals, and the wooden floors settled with soft groans that I learned to expect. Sometimes the motion-activated lights would flicker on in empty hallways, triggered by what I assumed were mice or the building's shifting foundations. It was during my 4th week that I first noticed the sounds from upstairs. I was mopping near the main staircase when I heard what sounded distinctly like footsteps above me. Not the random creaking Mrs. Chen had mentioned, but deliberate, measured steps moving from one end of the hallway to the other. When I stopped working to listen more carefully, the sound stopped too. When I resumed mopping, they started again, as if someone were mimicking my movements from the floor above. I called Mrs. Chen the next morning. She listened patiently to my concerns and assured me that the heating system in old buildings could create all sorts of unusual sounds. "The important thing is that you stick to the first floor," she reminded me. "There's really nothing up there that needs your attention." Her tone had that same careful quality I'd noticed during my first day, as if she were choosing her words very deliberately, but curiosity, as it tends to do, got the better of me. The following night, armed with my flashlight and the master key ring, I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors and darkened classrooms. It looked exactly like the first floor, except for the thick layer of dust that coated everything and the absence of cheerful student displays on the walls. The air felt different up here, heavier somehow, with an underlying staleness that suggested the windows hadn't been opened in years. Most of the rooms were locked, but a few doors stood slightly ajar. I pushed one open and stepped inside what had clearly once been a classroom. Desks sat in perfect rows covered in white sheets like ghosts. A chalkboard still bore the faint traces of old lessons, mathematical equations and spelling words that had never been fully erased. Everything was preserved exactly as it had been left, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-lesson. It was in the 3rd classroom that I found the papers. Student assignments scattered across the teacher's desk, all bearing the same date from 15 years ago. The handwriting was that careful, deliberate script of young children still learning to form letters. Most were typical elementary exercises, what I did last summer in simple math problems. But as I read through them, I noticed something unsettling. Many of the essays mentioned a special visitor who came to their class. A tall man in a gray suit who told them wonderful stories and promised to take them on exciting adventures. The children's descriptions of this visitor were remarkably consistent. He always wore the same gray suit, always carried a leather briefcase, and always had the most beautiful singing voice. Several students wrote about how he would call to them from the playground after school, how he knew their names even though they'd never met him before. One assignment, written in pink crayon by a girl named Sarah, described how the visitor had shown her a special room in the basement where they could play games that no grown-ups would understand. I'd never seen a basement in this building. According to the building plans Mrs. Chen had shown me, Millbrook Elementary was built on a concrete slab. There was no basement, no lower level of any kind. Yet here was a child's innocent description of descending stairs to a room filled with other children, who'd also met the special visitor. Sarah wrote about how quiet it was down there, how peaceful, and how the visitor had promised they could all stay and play forever if they wanted to. That night, I couldn't concentrate on my work. The usual sounds of the building seemed amplified, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Twice I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. The footsteps from upstairs resumed around midnight, but this time they seemed more purposeful, as if someone were searching for something. Or someone. I researched the school's history the next day. What I discovered explained Mrs. Chen's carefully worded warnings and the district's urgency in filling the janitor position. 15 years ago, Millbrook Elementary had been the site of a tragedy that the local news had covered extensively, though those reports seemed to have been scrubbed from most online archives. A man named Thomas Meridian had somehow gained access to the school during after-hours activities. He'd been found in one of the second-floor classrooms, apparently having suffered a heart attack while the building was supposed to be empty. The strange part was what happened in the weeks following Meridian's death. Students began reporting encounters with their special visitor had continued, even though the man was gone. Children would arrive at school with stories about meeting him in the hallways, about his promises and his songs. Several students were found in areas of the building they shouldn't have been able to access, including a utility room in the basement level that, according to official records, didn't exist. The school board had quietly closed the second floor and reassigned its classes to other buildings in the district. They'd installed additional security measures and strictly limited after-hours access. The night janitor position had seen frequent turnover, with most employees lasting only a few weeks before finding other work. Mrs. Chen had been very careful to hire people who would stick to specific areas and not ask too many questions. Armed with this knowledge, I should have quit immediately. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the second floor the following night. The student papers were exactly where I'd left them, but now there were more scattered across other desks. As I read through additional assignments, a clearer picture emerged of Thomas Meridian's time at the school. He'd been a substitute teacher, well liked by students and staff alike. His sudden presence in the building after hours remained unexplained, but the children's writings suggested he'd been visiting them long before his official death. The footsteps above me grew louder as I worked, and tonight they were accompanied by a sound I hadn't heard before. A low, melodious humming that seemed to drift through the ventilation system. It was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl, a lullaby-like tune that felt both ancient and deeply wrong. When I climbed the stairs to investigate, the humming grew stronger, seeming to emanate from the classroom where I'd found the first batch of papers. The door to that room now stood wide open, though I was certain I'd closed it the night before. Inside, the sheet-covered desks cast strange shadows in my flashlight beam, and the humming had become almost overwhelming. As I stood in the doorway, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of children's voices joining in with the melody. Soft, distant whispers of young voices singing along with that haunting tune, their words too faint to understand, but their presence unmistakable. I ran that night, left my supplies scattered in the first-floor hallway, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. Mrs. Chen wasn't surprised when I called to quit the next morning. She thanked me for my weeks of service and asked only that I not discuss my experiences at the school with others. The district would prefer to handle any concerns internally, she explained. I agreed, understanding now why the janitor position turned over so frequently. Next story, the midnight conversations. When my daughter Emma turned 2, we moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street, the one with the wraparound porch and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The previous owners had left in a hurry, something about a job transfer, though the neighbors whispered other reasons when they thought I wasn't listening. The house felt perfect for us, spacious enough for Emma to grow into, with built-in bookshelves and original hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. What sold me completely was Emma's reaction to her new bedroom on the second floor. She clapped her hands and ran straight to the bay window, pressing her little palms against the glass as if greeting an old friend. The baby monitor was a high-tech model my sister had given us for Emma's birthday, one of those fancy digital ones with crystal-clear audio and a range that covered the entire house. I'd grown accustomed to listening to Emma's sleep sounds through the receiver on my nightstand. Her gentle breathing, the occasional murmur of dream talk, the rustle of sheets as she turned over. These sounds had become my lullaby, reassuring me that my daughter was safe and peaceful just down the hall. The monitor had never given us any trouble in our old apartment, transmitting nothing but the expected symphony of a sleeping child. Everything changed 3 weeks after we settled into the house. I was lying in bed half asleep and listening to Emma's steady breathing through the monitor when I heard her voice pierce the silence. "Mama!" she called out, not crying or distressed, but speaking in that matter-of-fact tone toddlers use when they want attention. I waited, wondering if she was talking in her sleep or if she'd actually woken up. Then came another voice through the speaker, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Mama's sleeping, little one," the voice whispered back, gentle and soothing. "Go back to sleep now." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Someone was in my daughter's room. Someone speaking to her in the darkness. I shot out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood as I raced down the hallway. Emma's door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it when I tucked her in. I pushed it open, heart hammering against my ribs, and found Emma fast asleep in her toddler bed, her stuffed elephant clutched against her chest. The room was empty, shadows undisturbed, the air still and peaceful. I stood there for several minutes, listening to her deep, even breathing, searching every corner for signs of an intruder who had somehow vanished without a trace. The next morning, Emma seemed perfectly normal, chattering about her dreams over breakfast and playing with her blocks as if nothing unusual had happened. When I asked if anyone had visited her room during the night, she looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes and shook her head. I convinced myself I must have been dreaming, that the stress of moving and adjusting to a new house had played tricks on my tired mind. The baby monitor had probably picked up interference from another device, maybe a neighbor's monitor or a radio frequency bleeding through. These things happened with electronic devices, especially in older houses with questionable wiring. But it happened again 2 nights later. This time I was more alert, sitting up in bed with a book when Emma's voice came through the monitor. "I can't sleep," she said, and I heard the rustle of her sheets as she moved around in bed. The responding whisper came immediately, so clear and distinct that I couldn't dismiss it as interference or imagination. "Count the stars outside your window," the voice suggested. 1, 2, 3. They'll help you dream." I was already moving before the voice finished speaking, creeping down the hall as quietly as possible, hoping to catch whoever was in Emma's room. Again, I found her sleeping peacefully, though this time she was positioned differently, lying on her side facing the window where moonlight filtered through the curtains. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Emma would speak into the darkness, sometimes asking for water, sometimes mentioning a bad dream, sometimes just making the random observations that fill a toddler's mind. And always, without fail, the gentle voice would respond with comfort and reassurance. "The monsters aren't real, sweetheart. Daddy will come home from his trip soon. Close your eyes and think of puppies playing in a sunny field." The voice knew things, personal things about our family that no stranger could know. It spoke with the cadence of someone who cared deeply for Emma, someone who wanted to soothe her fears and help her find peace in sleep. I began staying awake deliberately, positioning myself in the hallway outside Emma's room, hoping to glimpse the source of these mysterious conversations. But every time I investigated, the room remained empty except for my sleeping daughter. I checked for hidden speakers, examined every inch of the walls and ceiling, even called in a technician to scan for electronic devices that might explain the phenomenon. Nothing. The baby monitor itself was functioning perfectly, showing no signs of interference or malfunction. According to every test and examination, there was no logical explanation for what I was hearing night after night. The voice began responding even when Emma hadn't spoken first. I would hear soft humming through the monitor, gentle lullabies that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Sometimes the voice would tell stories, elaborate tales of princess mice and brave little rabbits that went on for 20 or 30 minutes. Emma's sleep seemed deeper and more peaceful during these nocturnal storytelling sessions, and she began waking up happier, more rested than she'd been since we moved into the house. Whatever was happening in that room, it genuinely seemed to be helping my daughter sleep better. One evening, I decided to ask Emma directly about the voice. "Sweetheart," I said as I tucked her into bed, "do you sometimes talk to someone at night? Someone who tells you stories?" Her face lit up with a smile so radiant it took my breath away. "The nice lady," she said without hesitation. "She talks to me when you're sleeping. She knows lots of good stories, and she says she used to live here too." My throat constricted as Emma continued, her voice filled with childlike joy. "She misses her little girl very much, but she says I remind her of happy times. She's not scary, Mama. She's very kind." I spoke with Mrs. Henderson next door, an elderly woman who'd lived on the street for 40 years and knew the history of every house in the neighborhood. Her expression grew somber when I mentioned the previous owners and asked about the family who'd lived there before them. "Oh dear," she said, wringing her hands. "I wondered if you knew about Mary Catherine. Such a tragedy that was. She lived in your house back in the 70s with her husband and little daughter. The child was about your Emma's age when she passed from pneumonia one terrible winter. Mary Catherine never recovered from the loss. She spent years in that upstairs bedroom, the one you've made into your daughter's room, talking to her little girl as if she were still there." Mrs. Henderson continued her story, explaining how Mary Catherine had lived in the house until her own death 15 years ago, never able to let go of her grief or accept her daughter's absence. The neighbors could sometimes hear her at night, singing lullabies and telling bedtime stories to empty air. She was harmless, poor soul, just a mother who couldn't stop loving her child. The families who've lived there since have all mentioned strange sounds from that bedroom, but nothing frightening or dangerous. Just the echo of a mother's love that somehow lingered in those walls. That night, as I listened to the familiar whispered conversation through the monitor, I felt my fear transform into something else entirely, a deep, aching sympathy for a mother's love that death couldn't diminish. The voice continued its gentle ministrations, helping Emma drift into peaceful sleep with stories of woodland creatures and faraway kingdoms where children were always safe and loved. I realized that Mary Catherine wasn't haunting our house in any malevolent way. She was simply continuing to do what mothers do, offering comfort and companionship to a child who needed it. Now, 6 months later, I no longer investigate when the conversations begin each night. Instead, I listen with gratitude to the tender exchanges between my living daughter and the spirit of a mother who refuses to let death end her nurturing instincts. Emma sleeps better than ever, waking each morning with stories of the wonderful dreams the nice lady helped her have. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I whisper my own thanks through the darkness, knowing that Mary Catherine can hear me, one mother to another sharing the eternal bond of wanting nothing more than our children's happiness and peaceful sleep. Next story, The Recording Eye. I never considered myself particularly paranoid about technology, but something changed the morning I woke up to find my phone camera already recording. The red dot glowed steadily in the corner of my screen, indicating that 15 minutes and 37 seconds of footage had been captured while I slept. I live alone in my small apartment on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house. and I distinctly remembered placing my phone on the nightstand, face down, before falling asleep the previous evening. The timestamp showed the recording had begun at 3:47 a.m. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed the playback button, unsure what I might discover. The footage was dark at first, showing nothing but the faint outline of my sleeping form beneath the covers. The phone's camera was angled toward my bed, though I couldn't understand how it had moved from its face-down position to capture this view. For several minutes, nothing happened except the steady rise and fall of my breathing under the blankets. Then, at the 4-minute mark, something shifted in the shadows near my bedroom door. The automatic night vision mode had activated, casting everything in that eerie green-white glow that security cameras use. A figure stood motionless in the doorway, tall and thin, though the poor resolution made it impossible to distinguish any features. My blood ran cold as I watched this intruder simply observe me sleeping, never moving closer, never making a sound that the phone's microphone could detect. What disturbed me most was how long the figure remained there. Minutes passed in the recording as this presence maintained its vigil, occasionally tilting its head as if studying me from different angles. I fast-forwarded through segments, watching the timestamp advance while this mysterious observer never wavered from their position. Near the end of the recording, the figure seemed to notice the phone itself, turning slightly toward the camera before the footage abruptly ended. I searched every corner of my apartment that morning, checking locks, windows, and even the fire escape outside my bedroom. Everything remained secure, exactly as I had left it the night before. The deadbolt was engaged, the chain lock fastened, and the windows were still latched from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no disturbed belongings, nothing missing or out of place except for my phone's mysterious repositioning and that inexplicable recording. The second night, I deliberately placed my phone in the kitchen before bed, hoping distance might prevent whatever had caused the previous incident. I also wedged a chair under my bedroom door handle and checked every lock twice. Despite these precautions, I woke to find my phone once again displaying an active recording screen. This time, 23 minutes and 12 seconds had been captured, and the device somehow sat on my dresser across the room, positioned perfectly to frame my bed. The footage from the second night was far more disturbing. The same figure appeared in my doorway at approximately 3:45 a.m., but this time it carried something in its hands. In the grainy night vision, the object appeared to be another phone, its screen glowing softly as the figure held it up, seemingly taking photographs of me while I slept. The synchronicity was unmistakable. As my phone recorded this intruder, the intruder was apparently recording me in return. I spent the entire following day researching possible explanations. Perhaps my phone had some malfunction causing it to activate recording mode automatically. Maybe sleepwalking could account for the device's changing positions. Though I had never experienced such episodes before, I even considered the possibility of someone accessing my phone remotely, though that wouldn't explain the physical relocation of the device or the clear footage of an actual person in my apartment. That evening, I decided to stay awake and observe. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the bedroom doorway, keeping my phone beside me and checking it frequently to ensure it wasn't recording. The hours crawled by as I maintained my vigilant watch, fighting off waves of drowsiness that threatened to overwhelm me. Every small sound, the building settling, neighbors moving about, traffic outside, set my nerves on edge. Around 3:30 a.m., my eyelids grew impossibly heavy despite my determination to stay alert. I remember blinking slowly, struggling to keep my eyes open, when suddenly I felt an overwhelming compulsion to sleep. It wasn't natural drowsiness, but something more powerful, as if consciousness itself was being pulled away from me against my will. The last thing I recalled was the sensation of my phone growing warm in my hand. I awoke hours later on the living room couch, sunlight streaming through the windows. My phone displayed another recording, 47 minutes and 18 seconds of footage. My heart hammered as I realized I had somehow failed in my attempt to stay awake, succumbing to that strange, irresistible urge to sleep despite my best efforts to remain conscious. The third recording was the most unsettling yet. It began with me sitting upright on the couch, but my posture seemed wrong somehow. My head was tilted at an unnatural angle and my eyes appeared to be open, staring directly into the camera with an expression I didn't recognize as my own. For nearly 20 minutes, this version of myself sat motionless, holding the phone steady and maintaining that disturbing gaze into the lens. Then, still staring at the camera, I watched myself stand and walk toward the bedroom. My movements were fluid but strange, lacking the natural rhythm of normal human locomotion. The phone's perspective bounced slightly as I carried it, but the focus remained fixed on recording my own actions. I observed myself enter the bedroom and position the phone on the dresser, angling it carefully toward the bed before climbing under the covers with that same unnatural precision. The recording continued for several more minutes, showing me lying in bed completely still except for breathing that seemed too regular, too measured to be natural sleep. Near the end of the footage, my recorded self turned toward the camera one final time, and I could swear I saw something in those eyes that wasn't quite human, an intelligence that didn't belong to me. I haven't slept in my apartment for 3 nights now, choosing instead to stay with a friend across town. But even here, in an unfamiliar place surrounded by other people, I notice small changes in my phone's behavior. Sometimes I catch it opening the camera application on its own, though it hasn't begun recording yet. The battery drains faster than normal, and occasionally I detect a faint warmth emanating from the device even when I'm not using it. Yesterday, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I understood about my situation. While scrolling through my photo gallery, looking for something completely unrelated, I found dozens of images I didn't remember taking. They were all photographs of me sleeping, captured from various angles and on different nights, with timestamps going back weeks before the recording incidents began. The most recent photos show me in my friend's guest room, taken just last night while I thought I was safely sleeping in an entirely different location. In these images, my eyes are open again, staring directly at the camera with that same unsettling expression I'd witnessed in the recordings. But here's what truly terrifies me. According to the metadata, these photos weren't taken with my phone at all. They were taken with someone else's device, uploaded to my gallery through some method I cannot comprehend. Which means whatever is happening to me isn't confined to my apartment, my phone, or even my physical location. Something has been watching me, studying me, and perhaps slowly replacing me with something else entirely. I'm sharing this account because I need others to know what happened, in case I disappear or change in ways that make me unrecognizable to those who know me. If you ever wake up to find your phone camera already recording, don't watch the footage alone, and whatever you do, don't try to stay awake to catch whatever is causing it. Because I'm beginning to suspect that the figure in my doorway, the one who seemed to be photographing me while my phone recorded them, I think that figure was me. Next story. The man I keep seeing on the subway looks exactly like me. The first time I saw him, I thought it was a trick of the fluorescent lighting in the subway car. You know how those harsh lights can play games with your perception, casting strange shadows and making familiar faces look foreign in the amber glow? I was sitting in my usual spot on the 7:42 morning train into the city, scrolling through my phone and trying to wake up with lukewarm coffee from the bodega near my apartment. That's when I noticed him sitting 3 rows ahead of me, facing the opposite direction. From behind, everything about him seemed familiar in that unsettling way that makes your skin crawl. His hair was the same shade of brown as mine, cut in the exact same style with that stubborn cowlick on the left side that never quite lies flat no matter how much product I use. He wore a navy blue pea coat identical to the one I had purchased just 2 weeks prior from a small boutique downtown. Even his posture mirrored mine, That slight forward lean with shoulders hunched in the way my mother always told me would ruin my spine. The train pulled into Grand Central, and as passengers shuffled toward the doors, he stood up. For just a moment, just a brief second as he turned toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of his profile. My blood went cold. The curve of his nose, the angle of his jaw, the way his left ear stuck out slightly more than his right, it was like looking at myself from across the car. But before I could get a better look, he was swept away in the crowd of commuters, disappearing into the sea of people rushing to start their day. I convinced myself it was nothing more than an odd coincidence. After all, there are millions of people in this city, and surely some of them had to share similar features. Perhaps I was just tired, stressed from the new job, projecting familiar characteristics onto a stranger's silhouette. These things happen when your mind is preoccupied, when the monotony of daily routine makes you hyper-aware of every small deviation from the norm. But then it happened again 3 days later, on the same train, at the same time. This time he was sitting closer, just one row ahead and to my right. I could see more of him now, and the similarities were impossible to ignore. He carried the same black leather messenger bag I used for work documents, worn in exactly the same spots where the strap had rubbed against the material over months of daily use. His hands, when he reached up to adjust the overhead reading light, were the same size and shape as mine, complete with the small scar on his right index finger from a childhood accident involving a kitchen knife and an ambitious attempt at helping my grandmother prepare Sunday dinner. I found myself studying him with an intensity that bordered on obsession, memorizing every detail I could observe from my vantage point. The way he occasionally ran his fingers through his hair when concentrating on something on his phone. The habit of checking his watch every few minutes, always lifting his wrist in that particular way that caused his sleeve to slide down just slightly. Even his breathing pattern seemed familiar. That deep inhale followed by a slow, controlled exhale that I recognized as my own technique for managing anxiety in crowded spaces. When the train reached his stop, he stood and walked toward the doors with a gait that made my stomach lurch. It was my walk, that slightly uneven rhythm caused by an old soccer injury that left my right leg just a fraction shorter than my left. As he stepped onto the platform, he turned back toward the train for just a moment, and our eyes met through the window. The face that looked back at me was unmistakably my own, down to the small mole just below my left eyebrow and the tiny gap between my front teeth that I had always been self-conscious about. Over the following weeks, these encounters became more frequent and more unsettling. He appeared on different train cars at different times of day, on different lines throughout the subway system. Sometimes he would be there when I boarded, already seated and reading a newspaper with the casual indifference of any other commuter. Other times he would get on at a stop after mine, walking past me without acknowledgement as he found a seat further down the car. I began documenting these sightings in a small notebook, recording the time, location, and any specific details I could observe. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. He seemed to be living a parallel version of my life, making the same commutes at slightly different times, wearing clothes that were identical to items in my own wardrobe, carrying out the same mundane rituals that defined my daily existence in this sprawling urban maze. The most unnerving incident occurred on a Thursday evening in late October. I was riding the downtown express after a particularly long day at the office, exhausted and eager to get home to the quiet sanctuary of my apartment. The train was unusually crowded for that time of evening, packed with tourists and locals heading to dinner reservations and evening entertainment. I was standing near the doors, holding on to one of the metal poles for balance, when the train entered a tunnel and the lights flickered momentarily. In that brief moment of semi-darkness, I saw him standing directly across from me on the other side of the car. He was staring at me with the same mixture of fascination and horror that I imagined was written across my own face. We stood there separated by perhaps 10 feet and dozens of oblivious passengers, studying each other with an intensity that seemed to create an invisible bubble around us despite the crowd. The lights stabilized, and I could see him more clearly than ever before. Everything about him was perfect, an exact duplicate of my appearance down to the smallest detail. He was wearing the same shirt I had put on that morning, the same watch my father had given me for my college graduation, the same shoes that I had resoled just the previous month because I could not bear to throw away such comfortable footwear. But it was his expression that truly unsettled me. He looked tired, not just physically exhausted, but emotionally drained in a way that suggested he had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. His eyes held a sadness that seemed to go deeper than simple melancholy, a kind of existential weariness that I recognized because I had seen it in my own reflection during particularly difficult periods of my life. As the train pulled into the next station,
He began moving toward the doors.
I found myself pushing through the crowd, desperate to follow him, to confront this impossible duplicate and demand answers to questions I could barely formulate. But the mass of people boarding and disembarking made progress nearly impossible, and by the time I reached the platform, he had vanished into the labyrinthine corridors of the station. I spent the next hour searching every level, every platform, every corner of that underground complex, but found no trace of him. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the shadows between the fluorescent lights, becoming one with the perpetual twilight that exists in the depths of the city's transit system. That night I called in sick to work and spent hours researching doppelgangers, parallel dimensions, and every supernatural explanation I could find for what I had been experiencing. Now, months later, I still see him occasionally. Sometimes he is there when I least expect it, sitting quietly in a corner of the subway car with a book or newspaper, blending seamlessly into the background of urban anonymity. Other times I catch glimpses of him on the platform as my train pulls away from a station, standing motionless among the waiting passengers as if he exists in a slightly different time stream than the rest of us. I have never tried to approach him again, and he has never acknowledged my presence directly since that night in October. We exist in this strange parallel state, two identical figures moving through the same spaces at different moments, like reflections that have somehow become separated from their source. Sometimes I wonder if he sees me the way I see him, if he goes home to an apartment that mirrors mine and documents our encounters in his own notebook, questioning his sanity and searching for explanations that refuse to reveal themselves. The strangest part is that I have begun to find a peculiar comfort in these sightings, as if knowing he is out there somewhere makes the vastness of the city feel less lonely, less overwhelming. We are connected by this inexplicable phenomenon, bound together in a mystery that belongs to us alone. Next story, The Rules of Seven. When my daughter Emma first moved to Millbrook with her family, I thought the small mountain town would be perfect for raising children. The kind of place where kids could still play outside until the streetlights came on, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where the biggest worry was whether the general store would run out of ice cream on hot summer days. I had no way of knowing about the peculiar tradition that the local children had maintained for generations, or how desperately they needed that seventh player to make their games complete. Emma called me 3 weeks after they'd settled into their new house, her voice bubbling with the kind of excitement that only an 8-year-old can manage. She'd made friends with the neighborhood kids, she told me, and they'd invited her to join their weekly game of hide-and-seek in the woods behind Maple Street. There were 6 regulars, she explained, twins Jake and Josh, quiet little Sarah with her thick glasses, bold Mia who always wore her lucky red sneakers, Tommy who knew every trail in the forest, and gentle Ben who never seemed to speak above a whisper. With Emma, they would finally have their lucky 7. I remember feeling pleased that she'd integrated so quickly into the community. Small-town children, I reasoned, probably knew those woods like their own backyards. Their parents had likely played in the same groves and clearings, and their grandparents before them. There was something comforting about that continuity, that sense of place and belonging that city children rarely experienced. When Emma asked if she could join their Saturday afternoon games, I encouraged her wholeheartedly. The first few weeks passed without incident. Emma would return home as the sun began to set, her cheeks flushed with exertion and her eyes bright with the joy of acceptance. She spoke fondly of her new friends, how they'd taught her the best hiding spots among the old oak trees, how they'd shown her the creek that ran through the deepest part of the woods, how they'd explained the unwritten rules that made their game so special. The children had been playing together for years, she said, and they'd developed an elaborate system of boundaries and safe zones that made their version of hide-and-seek far more sophisticated than the simple playground variety. It was during the fourth week that Emma first mentioned the counting discrepancy, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than a child's confusion with numbers. She'd come home slightly subdued, picking at her dinner while recounting the afternoon's events. When it had been her turn to seek, she'd explained, she'd found all 6 of her friends without much difficulty. But when they'd gathered in their traditional circle to decide who would be it next, someone had counted 7 players instead of the correct 6. I suggested that perhaps one of the children had simply miscounted, or maybe someone had counted twice. These things happened during games, I assured her. Children got excited, they lost track, they made simple mistakes. Emma nodded at my explanation, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She mentioned that this had happened before according to the other kids, and that it was actually a normal part of their weekly ritual. Someone always counted an extra player, though no one could ever figure out who. Over the following weeks, Emma's accounts of these counting inconsistencies became more frequent and more detailed. It wasn't just one child making the error, she reported. Different kids would count 7 on different days, and they all seemed to accept this as a natural quirk of their woodland games. Sometimes Jake would count 7, sometimes it would be Sarah or Tommy. The count was always done in a circle, with each child pointing to the next as the numbers progressed, and inevitably, someone would reach 7 despite there being only 6 visible players. What began to unsettle me wasn't just the persistence of this mathematical impossibility, but Emma's growing acceptance of it. She spoke about the extra count as casually as she might mention the weather, as if mysterious phantom players were simply part of childhood in Millbrook. When I pressed her for more details, she would shrug and explain that the other children had been dealing with it for years. Their older siblings had experienced the same thing, and their parents before them. It was just how hide-and-seek worked in their particular woods. I decided to speak with some of the other parents at the school pickup line, curious to hear their perspective on this unusual tradition. What I discovered was both reassuring and deeply troubling. Yes, they confirmed their children had always reported the same counting anomaly during their forest games. No, none of them could explain it satisfactorily. Most seemed to view it as a harmless quirk, perhaps the result of children's overactive imaginations or their tendency to embellish stories. Some even smiled fondly when discussing it, remembering their own experiences with the lucky 7 count from their own childhoods in Millbrook. But I noticed something else in their expressions, a subtle tightness around their eyes when the subject lingered too long. They were quick to change topics, eager to discuss homework assignments or upcoming school events rather than dwell on the mysterious mathematics of their children's games. It was as if they'd made a collective decision to accept the inexplicable rather than investigate it too deeply. In a town where families had lived for generations, perhaps some questions were better left unasked. As autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, Emma's Saturday adventures began to take on a different quality. She still returned home happy and tired, but there were new elements to her stories that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The children had begun to incorporate the phantom 7th count into their actual gameplay, she explained. Instead of dismissing the extra number, they would deliberately seek 7 hiding spots during each round, even though only 6 players were concealed in the woods. This modification to their rules yielded disturbing results. Emma described finding footprints that belonged to none of her friends, discovering disturbed leaves and broken twigs in places where no one should have been hiding. During one particularly memorable game, she'd followed a trail of small impressions in the soft earth near the creek, convinced that she was tracking one of the twins to their hiding spot. The trail had led her deeper into the woods than she'd ever ventured before, through sections of forest that seemed older and more dense than the familiar playing areas near the neighborhood. She never found whoever had left those tracks, but she'd heard something moving through the underbrush just ahead of her, always staying just beyond her line of sight. Branches would snap and leaves would rustle, creating the unmistakable sound of someone trying to move quietly through the forest. When she'd called out, assuming it was one of her friends playing an elaborate trick, the sounds had stopped completely. The woods had fallen into such perfect silence that even the usual bird calls and insect buzzing seemed muted and distant. Emma had eventually given up the pursuit and returned to the designated playing area, where she'd found all 6 of her friends accounted for and waiting for her. None of them claimed to have been near the creek, and their shoes showed no signs of the muddy soil she'd been tracking through. When she described the mysterious trail and the sounds in the deeper woods, the other children had exchanged meaningful glances, but offered no explanations. This too, apparently, was simply part of how their games unfolded in the Millbrook Forest. The final Saturday of October brought the incident that convinced me to intervene. Emma returned home earlier than usual, her face pale and her usual post-game chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. Over dinner, she carefully recounted an experience that chilled me more than any previous story. During their final round of the day, when dusk was already settling over the woods and the children were preparing to head home, they decided to try something different. Instead of having one person seek while 6 others hid, they'd chosen to seek as a group, working together to find the 7th player that their count always seemed to include. Moving through the woods in a tight cluster, calling out and searching systematically, they'd eventually heard a response to their calls. A voice had answered from somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond their usual boundaries, speaking in a tone that was almost familiar but somehow not quite right. Following the voice, the children had ventured further into the woods than ever before, until they'd reached a small clearing that none of them remembered seeing during their years of play. In the center of this clearing stood a single large tree, its trunk twisted into unusual spirals, and its branches forming patterns that seemed to shift and change in their peripheral vision. The voice had seemed to come from somewhere within or behind this tree, continuing to call out to them in words they couldn't quite understand. That's when Emma had noticed something that made her grab Tommy's hand and back slowly away from the clearing. The voice calling to them wasn't just familiar because it sounded like a child from their group. It was familiar because it sounded exactly like her own voice, calling her own name, inviting her to come closer to the spiraling tree. The other children had heard it too, each of them recognizing the sound of their own voice echoing back from the shadows, speaking words they'd never spoken and inviting them deeper into the woods. Next story, the apartment on Maple Street. Moving into my first apartment should have been exciting, but from the moment I stepped into the cramped studio on Maple Street, something felt off. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, was eager to hand over the keys and disappear, barely giving me time to ask about utilities or building policies. The rent was suspiciously cheap for downtown, and when I mentioned this to my friends, they just shrugged and said I'd gotten lucky. But luck, I would soon learn, had nothing to do with it. The apartment itself seemed ordinary enough, hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, a kitchenette with appliances from the 80s, and a single window that looked out onto the fire escape of the building next door. The previous tenant had left behind a few items, some books, a coffee maker, and oddly enough, a shoebox tucked away in the back of the bedroom closet. I almost threw it out with the rest of the debris, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, I found a collection of old Polaroid photographs, the kind with the thick white borders that instantly transport you back to simpler times. Most of the photos showed typical apartment life: birthday parties, holiday gatherings, quiet moments of people I didn't recognize living their lives in what was now my space. There was something oddly comforting about looking through them, like inheriting someone else's memories. I found myself studying the faces, wondering about their stories, their relationships, their dreams. The apartment looked different in the photos, furnished with different furniture, painted different colors, but unmistakably the same space I now called home. That's when I found the photograph that changed everything. Buried near the bottom of the box, beneath layers of other people's memories, was a Polaroid of someone sitting on the windowsill, backlit by afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass. The person was wearing a blue sweater I recognized immediately because it was hanging in my closet, and they were holding a book I'd been reading just that morning. But it was the face that made my hands tremble and nearly dropped the photograph. The face was mine, not someone who looked like me, not a distant relative or a doppelganger. It was definitively, unmistakably me, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow and the way I unconsciously tucked my hair behind my ear when reading. But according to the date stamp in the corner, the photo had been taken 10 years ago, when I was living 3 states away, finishing high school, and had never even heard of this city, let alone this apartment building. I stared at the photograph for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possible explanations. Could it be a hoax? Some elaborate prank orchestrated by friends who somehow knew I'd end up in this exact apartment? The logistics alone made that impossible. Could there be some mistake with the date stamp? I examined the photo carefully, but the fading and yellowing of the Polaroid suggested it was genuinely old. The timestamp looked authentic, embedded in the film itself rather than added later. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. But as I compared the photograph to my reflection in the bathroom mirror, the similarities were too precise to dismiss. Every detail matched perfectly. The shape of my nose, the way my eyes crinkled slightly when I smiled, even the small mole on my cheek that I'd always been self-conscious about. This wasn't just someone who resembled me. This was me, in an apartment I'd never seen before, 10 years before I'd moved there. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the photograph. I carried it with me everywhere, pulling it out during lunch breaks and quiet moments to study it again, hoping to find some detail I'd missed that would provide a rational explanation. I researched the building's history, spending hours at the local library going through old records and newspaper archives. The building had been constructed in the 1960s and had housed dozens of tenants over the decades, but nothing in the official records explained what I'd found. I tried reaching out to Mrs. Chen, but she claimed to know nothing about the previous tenant who'd left the photographs behind. When I pressed her for details, she became evasive, saying only that the tenant had moved out suddenly and left no forwarding address. She seemed uncomfortable discussing it, changing the subject whenever I brought up the shoebox or its contents. Her reluctance to provide information only deepened my unease and convinced me that she knew more than she was willing to share. The photograph began to affect my daily life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself unconsciously recreating the pose from the picture, sitting on the windowsill in the same position, wearing the same blue sweater. Sometimes I'd catch myself doing this without realizing it, as if some invisible force was guiding my actions. The apartment itself seemed to encourage these moments of déjà vu, with afternoon light streaming through the window at exactly the same angle as in the photograph. Strange dreams began to plague my nights, dreams where I was living different versions of my life in the same apartment, meeting people I'd never encountered but somehow knew intimately. In these dreams, I had different jobs, different relationships, different histories, but I was always in that same studio on Maple Street. I'd wake up with vivid memories of conversations I'd never had and experiences that felt more real than my actual life. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur in unsettling ways. One evening, while going through the rest of the photographs more carefully, I made another disturbing discovery. In several of the pictures showing parties and gatherings, I could spot myself in the background. Not prominently featured, but definitely present. There I was, laughing at a birthday party I'd never attended, raising a glass at a celebration I'd never participated in, talking with people I'd never met. Each photograph was dated years before I'd moved to the city, yet there I was, apparently living a parallel life I had no memory of. The realization that there were multiple photographs of me in the collection sent me spiraling into a state of paranoid investigation. I began mapping out the dates and trying to correlate them with my actual memories from those time periods. According to my own recollections and old journals, I could account for my whereabouts during every date stamped on these mysterious photographs, yet the evidence suggested I'd been living a double life I couldn't remember. I started having episodes where I'd lose track of time while in the apartment. I'd sit down to read in the morning and suddenly realize it was evening, with no clear memory of how the day had passed. During these lost hours, I'd apparently been living normally. There was evidence of meals prepared, laundry folded, emails sent, but I retained no conscious memory of these activities. It was as if someone else was inhabiting my body during these periods, someone who belonged in this apartment in ways I couldn't understand. The final piece of the puzzle came when I decided to take a Polaroid photograph of myself, using an old camera I'd bought at a thrift store. I positioned myself in the exact same spot as the original photograph, wearing the same clothes, holding the same book. When the picture developed, I expected to see a recreation of the mysterious image that had started this whole nightmare. Instead, the photograph showed the windowsill empty, sunlight streaming through the glass onto vacant space where I should have been sitting. I was holding the camera. I was sitting in the exact position. I could see my reflection in the window glass, but the photograph showed nothing. It was as if I didn't exist in that moment, as if I was somehow not solid enough to be captured by the film. The implications of this discovery were more terrifying than anything I'd uncovered before. If I wasn't showing up in photographs I was taking of myself, what did that say about my existence in this apartment, in this reality? Now I sit here in the growing darkness, surrounded by photographs of a life I can't remember living, in an apartment that seems to remember me better than I remember myself. The rational explanations have all crumbled away, leaving only the unsettling possibility that I've been living in this space far longer than I realize, trapped in some kind of temporal loop that resets my memories but preserves my presence in other people's photographs. Tomorrow I'll wake up and try to pretend this is all just stress from moving to a new city. But tonight I'll sit by the window and wonder if 10 years from now, some future tenant will find a photograph of me in a shoebox, wondering how they ended up in a picture they don't remember taking. Next story, someone left a cassette tape on my porch. It was my own voice screaming. The morning started like any other Tuesday in October, with the kind of crisp air that makes you grateful for your coffee, and the golden leaves that had begun their slow descent from my oak tree. I remember stepping outside to grab the newspaper, my bare feet cold against the wooden porch boards, when I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. Sitting perfectly centered on my welcome mat was a cassette tape, the kind I hadn't seen in years. Its black plastic case reflecting the early sunlight like a small, dark mirror. There was no note, no explanation, just this relic from another era waiting for me like some kind of analog message in a bottle. The label was handwritten in block letters that I didn't recognize, simply reading "For Sarah" in fading blue ink. My name. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the familiar click of the tape mechanism inside when I shook it gently. I looked up and down my street, searching for any sign of who might have left it, but the neighborhood was still wrapped in that early morning quiet, where even the birds seemed to whisper their songs. I carried the tape inside with me, setting it on my kitchen counter while I made breakfast and tried to convince myself it was probably nothing more than an old friend playing an elaborate prank. Maybe it was a recording from high school, some embarrassing moment captured for posterity and now returned to haunt me decades later. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something about the tape felt wrong, felt heavy with intention in a way that made my stomach clench with an anxiety I couldn't quite name. The problem was finding something to play it on. I spent the better part of the morning rummaging through closets and storage boxes, wondering when I had become the kind of person who threw away perfectly good electronics just because they were outdated. Finally, in the back of my bedroom closet behind a stack of winter coats, I found my old boombox from college, its silver and black plastic scarred with years of use but still functional when I plugged it into the wall. I sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor, the cassette player in front of me like some kind of shrine to obsolete technology, and carefully inserted the tape. The machine made that familiar whirring sound as it engaged, and for a moment, I was transported back 20 years to when music came on physical media, and you had to rewind things by hand. I pressed play and settled back to listen, expecting maybe some forgotten conversation or perhaps a mixtape I had made for someone who was now returning the favor. What came through the speakers instead was silence. The kind of empty hiss that meant the tape was running but nothing had been recorded. I waited, adjusting the volume and checking the connections, wondering if maybe the tape was blank or damaged. Then, faint at first but growing clearer, I heard breathing. Not the steady rhythm of someone at rest, but the quick, shallow gasps of someone in distress, someone trying very hard not to make noise but failing to control their fear. The breathing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and I found myself holding my own breath in sympathy, my heart rate matching the panicked rhythm coming from the speakers. Then came the voice and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was my voice, unmistakably mine, but twisted with a terror I had never heard from myself before. I was pleading, begging someone or something to stop, my words broken by sobs that sounded like they were being torn from my chest. I fumbled for the stop button, my hands shaking so badly I could barely coordinate my movements. But somehow I needed to hear more. The voice on the tape, my voice, was describing something that made no sense, talking about darkness that moved like water and shadows that had weight and substance. I heard myself screaming about things watching me from corners that couldn't exist, about doors that led to rooms that weren't there when I looked directly, but appeared in my peripheral vision like some kind of architectural ghost. The most disturbing part wasn't the content of what I was saying, though that was certainly unsettling enough. It was the quality of the fear in my voice, the absolute conviction that whatever I was experiencing was real and immediate and inescapable. This wasn't the kind of performance you could fake, wasn't the result of some elaborate hoax or poorly conceived joke. The terror was too raw, too genuine, too specific in its desperation to be anything other than authentic. But I had never experienced anything like what I was hearing. I had never been in a situation where I would scream like that, had never encountered anything that would reduce me to the broken, pleading creature whose voice was now filling my bedroom with its anguish. The disconnect between my memory and what I was hearing created a kind of psychological vertigo that left me feeling unmoored from my own sense of reality. I let the tape play until it reached the end, through what must have been hours of my own voice, describing an escalating nightmare that I had no memory of living through. The quality of the recording was too good to be old, the technology too clear to be from years past, which meant this had been recorded recently with equipment sophisticated enough to capture every nuance of my terror. Someone had been there with me during whatever had happened, had been close enough to record my breakdown without helping, without intervening, without even making their presence known. The weeks that followed were a study in slowly unraveling sanity. I found myself questioning everything, checking and rechecking my memories for gaps or inconsistencies that might explain the tape's existence. I made appointments with doctors, convinced that I was suffering from some form of dissociative disorder that was causing me to lose time and experience trauma I couldn't remember. but every test came back normal. Every evaluation suggested I was mentally and physically healthy. I started paying attention to my dreams, keeping a notebook by my bedside to record anything unusual, but my nights were peaceful and my sleep undisturbed. I installed security cameras around my house, thinking that maybe I was sleepwalking or experiencing some kind of nocturnal episodes that I wasn't aware of, but the footage showed nothing more interesting than me sleeping soundly through the night and going about my normal routines during the day. The tape became an obsession, a puzzle I couldn't solve no matter how many times I listened to it or how carefully I analyzed every word. I digitized the recording and ran it through audio software, looking for signs of manipulation or editing, but everything suggested it was a continuous, unaltered recording of genuine events. I had voice analysis done to confirm it was really me speaking, though by that point I had no doubt about the identification. That voice, even in its extremity, was undeniably mine. What disturbed me most was how the terror on the tape seemed to be escalating towards something, building to some climactic horror that was approaching, but never quite arrived within the recording's time frame. The timestamp on the cassette suggested it was nearly 6 hours long. 6 hours of my life that I had apparently lived through but could not remember. 6 hours of experiencing something so terrible that it had reduced me to an animal state of pure fear. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, I began to notice small changes in my environment that I couldn't account for. Objects in my house would be moved slightly from where I remembered leaving them. Not dramatically, but just enough to create that unsettling feeling that someone else had been there. I would find doors open that I was certain I had closed, lights on in rooms I hadn't visited, windows unlatched despite my careful security routines. The changes were subtle enough that I might have dismissed them as the ordinary forgetfulness of daily life, except for the tape. The existence of that recording had made me hyper-aware of the possibility that my reality was more fragile than I had assumed, that there were experiences I was capable of having, but unable to remember, events that could be documented even if they couldn't be recalled. Now, as I sit here in the growing darkness of another October evening, I can feel something building around me like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The shadows in my house seem deeper than they should be, more substantial, and I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that vanish when I turn to look directly. I have the terrible suspicion that whatever created that tape is about to happen again, and this time I might be awake to remember it. The cassette player sits ready on my coffee table, a blank tape loaded and waiting to record whatever comes next, because I need to know what happens in those lost hours, even if the knowledge destroys me. Next story, the graveyard shift at Miller's Stop. I should have listened to the warnings, but desperation has a way of drowning out good sense. When I first saw the help wanted sign taped to the window of Miller's Stop, that lonely gas station sitting like a forgotten lighthouse beside Highway 49, I thought I'd found salvation. 3 months of unemployment had left me hollow-eyed and nearly broke, so the promise of $11 an hour seemed like a godsend, even if it meant working the graveyard shift at what appeared to be the most isolated fuel stop in 3 counties. The owner, a weathered man named Dale Miller, whose family had apparently run the station since the 1960s, hired me on the spot during what passed for the afternoon rush. I watched exactly 4 customers come through in the 2 hours I spent filling out paperwork in his cramped office behind the counter. The building itself seemed frozen in time, with its faded Coca-Cola signs, ancient cash register, and the kind of harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were dying of some wasting disease. Dale walked me through the basics during my first evening shift, his movements careful and deliberate as he showed me how to work the old pump controls and count down the register. He seemed nervous about something, constantly glancing at the big clock mounted above the coffee station, its red second hand sweeping toward midnight with mechanical persistence. When I asked about overnight procedures, he grew quiet for a long moment before speaking. The rules he gave me were simple enough at first glance, but something in his delivery made them feel more like warnings than instructions. "Lock the front door at midnight sharp," he said, "and only open it for customers who look normal and ask politely. Keep the lights on in the main store, but turn off the ones over the far pump, the one closest to the woods. If anyone came knocking after closing and didn't look right, I should ignore them completely. Most importantly, if I heard voices calling my name from outside, I absolutely should not respond or investigate." I asked what he meant by customers who didn't look normal, but Dale just shook his head and gathered his jacket. Before leaving, he paused at the door and told me that his family had been running Miller's Stop for 3 generations, and they'd learned there were certain accommodations you had to make when your business sat on old ground. When I pressed him for details, he simply said that some places were thinner than others, and Highway 49 had always been one of those places where things that should stay separate sometimes overlapped. My first few weeks passed quietly enough, though I began to understand what Dale meant about the location feeling thin. The silence out there wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the whole landscape was holding its breath. During the day, Miller's Stop felt merely run down and forgotten, but after midnight it took on a different character entirely. The shadows seemed deeper, and I found myself constantly checking the security monitor even though it only showed empty pumps and the dark tree line beyond. The customers who came through during those late hours were an odd bunch, though not in ways I could easily define. There was something slightly off about each of them, subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite articulate. A woman in a sundress who bought cigarettes on a freezing November night, her bare arms showing no sign of cold. A man who paid for gas with bills that looked crisp and new but felt strange under my fingers, almost like they were printed on the wrong kind of paper. A teenager who asked directions to a town I'd never heard of. Despite having lived in the area my whole life, I started keeping a notebook, partly out of boredom and partly because I was beginning to feel like I needed to document the strangeness. Most nights brought 1 or 2 of these unusual visitors, always polite, always paying an exact change, always disappearing quickly back into the darkness beyond the station's circle of light. Dale's warnings about keeping certain customers out began to make more sense when I realized that all of the ones I was letting in had asked to come inside properly, using please and thank you like they were following some script of human politeness. The first real test of Dale's rules came during my 3rd week, when someone started knocking on the glass door around 2 in the morning. I looked up from my book to see a figure silhouetted against the night, but something about the proportions seemed wrong. The person was too tall and thin, and their knocking was too rhythmic, like they were tapping out some kind of code. When I didn't respond, the knocking stopped, but I could see the shadow lingering by the door for another 10 minutes before finally moving away. The following night brought voices calling from the darkness beyond the pumps, though I couldn't see anyone out there on the security monitor. They knew my name somehow, calling it in friendly tones that almost convinced me to unlock the door and step outside to see who was there. I remembered Dale's warning just in time and forced myself to stay behind the counter, turning up the radio to drown out the voices until they finally faded away with the approaching dawn. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice patterns in the strangeness that surrounded Miller's Stop. The unusual customers seemed to come in waves, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single night, other times none for a week. They all shared certain characteristics beyond their subtle wrongness. They moved too smoothly, spoke too carefully, and had eyes that reflected the fluorescent lights like an animal's might. More concerning was how they always seemed to know things about me that strangers shouldn't, commenting on my book choices or asking about family members they couldn't possibly have met. The voices outside became a regular occurrence, usually starting around 2 or 3 in the morning and lasting until sunrise. Sometimes they sounded like people I knew, friends from college or relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Other times they were completely unfamiliar, but always friendly and inviting, always trying to convince me to come outside and join them. I learned to bring headphones and loud music to drown them out, though I could still sometimes hear my name being called even through the noise. Dale checked on me regularly during those first few months, always arriving just before my shift ended, always asking the same careful questions about unusual customers or strange occurrences. I got the impression he'd been through several night shift employees before me, though he never said what happened to them. When I mentioned the voices, he nodded grimly and told me I was handling things correctly. The important thing, he emphasized, was never to engage with anything that didn't follow the normal patterns of human behavior. Things escalated during the Christmas season. When the darkness came earlier and lasted longer, the unusual customers became more frequent and more obviously wrong, though still polite enough that I felt compelled by Dale's rules to serve them. One night, a family of 4 came in around midnight, all of them wearing summer clothes despite the December cold. The parents bought coffee and snacks while their children wandered the aisles, but I noticed the family cast no reflection in the security monitor, showing up only as empty space moving between the shelves. Another evening brought a customer who appeared normal at first glance, but cast a shadow that didn't match his movements, reaching and gesturing independently while he stood perfectly still at the counter. He bought a map of the local area and asked detailed questions about the history of Highway 49, specifically about any accidents or disappearances that might have occurred over the years. His questions felt like an interview, and I had the uncomfortable sense that my answers were being evaluated for some purpose I couldn't understand. The worst incident happened during a blizzard in January, when I thought the isolation and weather would keep everyone away. Instead, the storm seemed to bring out more of the wrong things than ever before. Throughout that long night, figures appeared at the windows and door with increasing frequency, some looking almost human while others were clearly something else entirely. They knocked and called and pressed their faces against the glass, but none of them asked to come in properly, so I followed Dale's rules and ignored them all. By morning, the snow around Miller's stop was covered with footprints that formed no coherent pattern, circling the building in spirals and figure eights like some kind of ritual dance had taken place during the storm. When Dale arrived that morning, he took one look at the tracks and told me I'd done well to stay inside. He spent the rest of the day walking the perimeter with a bag of salt, sprinkling it carefully along the foundation while muttering words I couldn't quite hear. I finally understood that Miller's stop wasn't just a gas station built on strange ground. It was a kind of way station between worlds, a place where travelers from elsewhere could stop and rest and pretend to be human for a little while. Dale's family had been the guardians of this threshold for decades, maintaining the delicate balance that kept both sides relatively safe. And now, whether I'd wanted it or not, I'd become part of that ancient, unspoken agreement. The job pays well enough, and I've learned to appreciate the strange predictability of it all. As long as I follow the rules and respect the boundaries, the night shift at Miller's stop is merely unsettling rather than dangerous. Though I sometimes wonder what happens to the travelers I serve, where they go when they disappear back into the darkness. Next story, the breathing behind the door. The night everything changed started like any other Tuesday in my small apartment on Maple Street. I had settled into my usual routine after work, sharing a simple dinner of leftover pasta with my golden retriever, Benny, who had been my faithful companion for the past 4 years. Benny was the kind of dog who rarely caused trouble, content to spend his evenings curled up at the foot of my bed or sprawled across the living room carpet, his gentle snoring providing a comforting soundtrack to my quiet life. He had never been one for excessive barking or nervous behavior, which is why what happened that night felt so profoundly unsettling from the very beginning. I remember checking the time on my phone before turning off the bedside lamp, noting that it was just past 11:30. The autumn wind was picking up outside, rattling the windows of my second-floor apartment with the kind of persistence that makes you grateful to be warm and safe indoors. Benny had already claimed his usual spot near my feet, his breathing steady and rhythmic as he drifted toward sleep. The familiar weight of him at the end of the bed had always been a source of comfort, a living reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in the world, especially during those long stretches when work kept me too busy for much of a social life. Something pulled me from deep sleep around 2 in the morning, though at first I couldn't identify what had disturbed my rest. The apartment felt different somehow, charged with an energy that hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. Benny was sitting upright at the foot of the bed, his entire body rigid with attention. His ears perked forward in a way I'd rarely seen before. He wasn't making any sound yet, but everything about his posture suggested he was listening to something I couldn't hear, focusing on some disturbance that had escaped my notice entirely. Then the barking began, low and insistent. Nothing like his usual cheerful woofs when someone knocked at the door, or when he spotted a squirrel through the window. This was different, deeper, tinged with something that sounded almost like fear or warning. His gaze was fixed unwaveringly on the closet door across from my bed, the same closet I'd been opening and closing without incident for the 3 years I'd lived in this apartment. The door was closed just as I always left it, but Benny was staring at it as if it had suddenly transformed into something threatening and unfamiliar. I sat up slowly, trying to shake off the fog of interrupted sleep while keeping my voice low and soothing. "What is it, boy? What's got you so worked up?" But even as I spoke, I found myself following his gaze to the closet door, and that's when I heard it too. At first I convinced myself it was just the building settling or perhaps the wind finding its way through some gap in the walls. But as I listened more carefully, the sound became impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. Something was breathing inside the closet, not the mechanical rhythm of a heating vent or the random creaking of old wood, but the deliberate, measured breathing of something alive. The inhalations were deep and slow, followed by equally deliberate exhalations that seemed to fog the air near the bottom of the door, though the lighting was too dim for me to be completely certain of what I was seeing. Benny's barking grew more urgent, and I noticed he was trembling slightly, his whole body tense with an anxiety I'd never witnessed in him before. My first instinct was to call out, to demand that whoever was in my closet identify themselves and explain how they'd gotten into my apartment. But something about the quality of that breathing stopped me, some indefinable wrongness that made my throat feel tight and my words stick before they could form. The breathing was too slow, too measured, as if whatever was producing it was savoring each breath, taking its time with the simple act of drawing air in and pushing it back out again. I reached for my phone, thinking I should call the police, but my hands were shaking badly enough that I nearly dropped it twice before managing to unlock the screen. The pale light from the display cast strange shadows around the room, making familiar objects look foreign and threatening. Benny had moved closer to me on the bed, pressing against my leg while maintaining his vigilant watch on the closet door. His barking now reduced to low, continuous growls that vibrated through his chest and into mine. The breathing continued, steady and patient, and I began to notice other details that made my skin crawl with an instinctive revulsion I couldn't quite explain. There was a slight whistle to each exhalation, as if the air was passing through something not quite right, not entirely human. The rhythm was too perfect, too consistent, lacking the natural variations that come with normal breathing. It was as if something was deliberately performing the act of breathing, going through the motions without the unconscious irregularities that mark the difference between the living and something else entirely. I forced myself to get out of bed, though every instinct screamed against approaching the closet door. Benny immediately jumped down beside me, positioning himself between me and the source of his distress, his protective instincts overriding his obvious fear. Together we moved slowly across the room, the old hardwood floors creaking softly under our combined weight. With each step closer, the breathing became more pronounced, more unmistakably real, and I caught what might have been a faint, sweetish odor that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. I stood before the closet door for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My hand hovering over the doorknob while that steady breathing continued just inches away on the other side. The metal felt unusually cold under my palm when I finally grasped it, cold enough that it almost seemed to burn against my skin. Benny had gone completely silent beside me, though I could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat from a fire. The door opened smoothly, without the slight stick it usually had, revealing the familiar interior of my closet with my clothes hanging in neat rows and my shoes arranged on the floor below. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it, down to the sweater I'd draped over a hanger just the day before. But the breathing sound had stopped the moment the door opened, cut off so abruptly that the silence felt almost violent in its intensity. The air inside the closet was noticeably colder than the rest of the room, and that strange floral scent was stronger here, mixed with something earthier that I didn't want to identify. Benny refused to enter the closet, planting his feet firmly at the threshold and whining softly when I tried to encourage him forward. I stepped inside alone, pushing clothes aside and examining every corner, looking for any sign of what might have been producing those sounds. The small space felt larger somehow, as if the walls had expanded beyond their normal dimensions, though I knew that was impossible. My hands moved through empty air where logic insisted a breathing presence had been moments before. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room chair with all the lights on, Benny curled tightly against my legs, both of us watching the hallway that led to the bedroom and that closet door, which I had left standing wide open. The breathing never returned that night, but neither of us managed to sleep again until the sun was well up and the apartment felt safe and normal once more. The next evening, as I prepared for bed, I noticed Benny taking up his position at the foot of the bed earlier than usual, his attention already fixed on the closet with the same intense focus as the night before. I had left the door open all day, hoping that daylight and fresh air might dispel whatever presence had manifested there. But as darkness settled over the apartment once again, I could see in my dog's posture that our visitor had returned. And sure enough, just as the clock in the kitchen chimed midnight, the breathing began again, slow and patient and deliberate, waiting in the darkness behind my hanging clothes with the infinite patience of something that had nowhere else it needed to be. Next story. The forest behind my house is growing closer every night. I've lived in this house for 7 years now, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that something impossible is happening in my backyard. When I first moved in, the tree line sat a comfortable 50 yards from my back porch. I measured it myself with a tape measure, marking the distance from the bottom step to the nearest oak tree with a small wooden stake I drove into the ground. Today, that same oak tree stands 37 yards from my porch, and the wooden stake is nowhere to be found. You might think I'm mistaken, that memory plays tricks and distances can seem different depending on light, weather, or perspective. I thought the same thing at first. That's why I started keeping detailed records, taking photographs from the same spot on my porch every morning at precisely 7 a.m., always using the same camera settings, always standing in the exact same position, marked by a piece of tape I placed on the wooden deck boards. The documentation began as a way to prove myself wrong, to demonstrate that my imagination was simply running wild after too many late nights working on my dissertation about ecological boundary shifts in suburban environments. The irony of that topic wasn't lost on me then, and it certainly isn't now. What started as an academic exercise in careful observation has become something much more troubling, a daily ritual that fills me with increasing dread even as I cannot bring myself to stop. The first photographs showed what appeared to be normal seasonal changes. Leaves falling, branches becoming more visible as autumn progressed, snow weighing down the pine boughs in winter. But when I lined up the images chronologically and measured the apparent distances using reference points like the old bird bath and the metal fence posts along the property line, a disturbing pattern emerged. The measurements were consistent, methodical, undeniable. The forest was moving closer to my house at a rate of approximately 2 to 3 inches per night. I know how that sounds. I've spent months trying to find rational explanations. Soil erosion, maybe, causing a gradual shift in the landscape. Root systems expanding and contracting with moisture levels. Some kind of optical illusion created by changing vegetation density. I've consulted geology texts, contacted soil specialists, even had a surveyor come out to establish official boundary markers. The surveyor, a pleasant woman named Carol with 30 years of experience, looked at my documentation with polite interest before gently suggesting that perhaps I was experiencing some stress-related perceptual issues. But the surveyor's markers told the same story as my photographs. Within a week of their installation, the brass pins that marked the forest edge were somehow 21 inches closer to my house than they should have been. When I called Carol to report this impossible development, she asked if I had been taking any new medications, or if there had been any major life changes recently that might be affecting my perception. Her voice carried the careful patience of someone speaking to a potentially unstable person. That was 3 months ago, and I've stopped calling professionals. Instead, I've refined my documentation methods to achieve a level of precision that would satisfy the most skeptical scientific review. Motion-activated cameras positioned at 3 different angles. Daily measurements using multiple tools calibrated against fixed reference points. Soil samples taken and analyzed for any unusual properties that might explain what appears to be a slowly migrating ecosystem. The forest doesn't move during the day. I've verified this through continuous observation during several weekend periods, when I position myself on the porch from sunrise to sunset, watching through binoculars for any sign of movement among the trees. During daylight hours, everything remains perfectly still, perfectly normal. Birds sing, squirrels chase each other up and down the oak trunks. Wind rustles the leaves in entirely predictable patterns. It's at night that the impossible happens. During those hours when darkness makes direct observation difficult and shadows play tricks with depth perception. I've tried staying awake to witness the phenomenon directly, but every attempt ends the same way. Sometime after midnight, despite my best efforts to remain alert, I find myself waking up in my chair on the porch as dawn breaks, discovering that the forest has advanced another few inches while I inexplicably slept. The movement isn't random. There's a deliberate quality to the way certain trees seem to lead the advance while others follow in formation. The old oak that I initially used as my measuring point has become something like a scout, always positioned at the leading edge of the migration. Behind it, a cluster of pine trees maintains perfect spacing, as if they're following some invisible choreography. Even the underbrush moves in coordination, maintaining the same density and distribution patterns as the entire forest creeps steadily toward my back door. I've begun to notice changes in the quality of sounds that emerge from the woods after dark. The typical nocturnal chorus of insects and small animals has taken on different characteristics, becoming more intense, more purposeful somehow. Owl calls seem to come from specific positions that correlate with the migration pattern, as if the birds are serving as some kind of communication network for the advancing trees. Sometimes I hear what sounds like creaking wood or settling timber, but it happens in rhythmic patterns that suggest movement rather than random environmental noise. Sleep has become increasingly difficult, not just because of my failed attempts to observe the nocturnal activity, but because of dreams that feel more like memories of things I've never experienced. In these dreams, I'm standing in my backyard during daylight, but the forest has advanced much further than it has in reality, with tree branches extending over my roof and roots beginning to buckle the foundation of my house. The dreams are notable for their complete ordinariness, their lack of typical dream logic or supernatural elements. Everything looks exactly as it does in waking life except for the position of the trees. What troubles me most about these dreams is their predictive quality. Twice now I've dreamed of the forest configuration in specific detail, only to wake up and discover through my morning measurements that reality has moved closer to matching what I experienced in sleep. It's as if the dreams are showing me glimpses of where the migration is heading, previews of future stages in whatever process is unfolding in my backyard. I've started researching the history of this property, looking through county records and old surveys to understand what might be driving this phenomenon. What I've found is both fascinating and unsettling. According to documents dating back to the early 1800s, this entire area was once completely forested, with no clearings or structures anywhere within a radius of several miles. The records show a gradual process of deforestation and development that carved out the suburban neighborhood where I now live, pushing the original forest back into increasingly smaller designated areas. The property surveys from different decades show the forest boundary in various positions, but there's an interesting pattern in the official measurements. During periods when development pressure was high, the forest appeared to retreat beyond its designated boundaries. But during economic downturns when construction slowed and some properties were abandoned, the boundary measurements show the forest returning to positions closer to its original extent. It's possible that what I'm observing is part of a much longer cycle, a gradual reclamation process that has been going on for generations, but is only noticeable to someone who pays careful attention over an extended period. Previous residents of this house might have experienced the same phenomenon without documenting it, or they might have documented it but been dismissed as unreliable observers, just as I have been. This theory provides some comfort, suggesting that I'm witnessing a natural process rather than something supernatural or threatening, but it doesn't explain the coordinated quality of the movement, the way different species seem to advance in formation, or the strange predictive nature of my dreams about future forest configurations. As I write this, the leading edge of the oak tree sits exactly 28 yards from my back porch, having advanced another 9 inches since yesterday morning. At the current rate of progress, the forest will reach the foundation of my house in approximately 18 months. I don't know what will happen when that boundary is crossed, whether the migration will stop, continue around the house, or somehow incorporate the structure into the expanding woodland. What I do know is that I've stopped trying to convince anyone else that this is happening. My documentation continues, partly out of scientific curiosity, and partly because the daily routine of measurement and photography has become a necessary anchor to rationality in a situation that defies rational explanation. Each morning I stand on my back porch, take my photographs, record my measurements, and accept that I'm living with a mystery that grows 3 inches closer to resolution every single night. Next story, the late shift. I never considered myself particularly ambitious, but there I was again, sitting in my dimly lit cubicle at 10:30 on a Thursday evening, the fluorescent lights humming their electric lullaby above an otherwise empty office floor. The custodial staff had finished their rounds hours ago, leaving behind the faint scent of industrial cleaner, and the kind of profound silence that only comes when a space meant for dozens of people suddenly contains just one. My coworkers had packed up and headed home to their families, their dinner plans, their evening routines, while I remained hunched over spreadsheets and quarterly reports, chasing a promotion that seemed to perpetually dance just beyond my reach. The building itself felt different after hours, as though it shed some invisible skin when the last employee clocked out and the security system engaged. The familiar sounds of office life, ringing phones, clicking keyboards, casual conversations, were replaced by the subtle creaks and sighs of a structure settling into nighttime. Even the elevator seemed to whisper differently, its mechanical voice echoing through empty corridors with an almost mournful quality. I had grown accustomed to these after-hours atmospheres over the past several months, finding an odd comfort in being the sole occupant of a space designed for community. My workstation sat in the middle of a cluster of 6 cubicles, arranged in what management optimistically called a collaborative pod. During the day, It buzzed with activity as my colleagues and I navigated the complex social dynamics of shared workspace. The careful negotiation of phone volumes, the delicate ballet of chair positioning, the unspoken protocols governing everything from lunch smells to personal decorations. But at night, those surrounding desks transformed into something altogether different, their empty chairs and darkened monitors creating a constellation of absent presence around my illuminated island of productivity. The computer across from mine belonged to Sarah, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s who had been with the company for nearly a decade. Her workspace was meticulously organized, featuring a small succulent garden, family photos arranged with mathematical precision, and a coffee mug that proclaimed her allegiance to some obscure British television series. During our rare conversations, she spoke with the measured cadence of someone who chose her words carefully, though I often caught her observing our shared workspace with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the mundane corporate environment we inhabited. That particular evening, I was deep in the meditative rhythm of data entry when something shifted in my peripheral vision. The sensation was subtle, like the shadow of a bird passing overhead, but insistent enough to draw my attention away from the glowing screen before me. When I looked up, Sarah's computer monitor was displaying what appeared to be our company's login screen, its blue and white graphics casting a familiar glow across her empty cubicle. The sight struck me as odd, since the IT department had implemented an aggressive power management system that automatically shut down all workstations after 30 minutes of inactivity. I returned to my work, attributing the anomaly to some scheduled maintenance routine or security protocol I wasn't aware of. Corporate IT departments were notorious for their mysterious ways, often implementing updates and modifications during off hours when they wouldn't disrupt daily operations. But as the minutes passed, I found myself glancing towards Sarah's workstation with increasing frequency, drawn by a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right about the situation. The login screen remained active far longer than any automated process should have required, its cursor blinking patiently in the password field as though waiting for input. The longer I observed it, the more convinced I became that I could detect subtle changes in the display. Slight variations in brightness, almost imperceptible shifts in the arrangement of text fields, tiny modifications that might have been tricks of my tired eyes or genuine alterations to the interface. Then, without warning, the screen changed. The login prompt disappeared, replaced by Sarah's familiar desktop wallpaper, a serene landscape photograph featuring rolling hills beneath an impossibly blue sky. Her various file folders and application shortcuts materialized in their usual precise arrangements, and I could see the taskbar at the bottom of the screen displaying several active programs. Someone had successfully logged into her account, which should have been impossible, since IT policy required individual passwords that were never shared between employees. My initial assumption was that Sarah had returned to the office to retrieve something she'd forgotten, though I hadn't heard the elevator or the security door that provided access to our floor. The building's acoustic properties were such that sounds carried clearly through the empty corridors, and I was certain I would have noticed her arrival. Still, there were other explanations. Perhaps she had been in a conference room or the break area when I arrived, or maybe she had special authorization to work late that I wasn't aware of. I stood up from my chair, intending to peer over the cubicle partition to confirm her presence, but something about the quality of light emanating from her workstation gave me pause. The glow seemed different somehow, more intense than normal, with an almost clinical brightness that made the surrounding area appear unusually stark. Her desk chair was positioned exactly as she had left it hours earlier, pushed neatly under the desk with its back facing outward. Yet the computer continued to display clear evidence of active use. As I watched, frozen in a half-standing position with my hands gripping the partition wall, windows began opening and closing on Sarah's screen with purposeful efficiency. I could see email applications launching, spreadsheets being accessed, various corporate databases being navigated with the kind of familiarity that suggested intimate knowledge of our company's systems. Whoever was using her computer possessed not only her login credentials but also detailed understanding of her daily workflows and responsibilities. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps Sarah was accessing her workstation remotely from home, using some VPN connection that allowed her to control her office computer from another location. Many companies offered such capabilities to facilitate flexible work arrangements, and it would explain how her account could be active without her physical presence. Yet something about the patterns of activity I was observing felt inconsistent with remote access protocols, too immediate and responsive for the slight delays that typically characterize such connections. I slowly lowered myself back into my chair, maintaining visual contact with Sarah's monitor while trying to appear absorbed in my own work. The screen activity continued with mechanical precision, documents opening and closing in sequences that seemed almost ritualistic in their repetition. Files were being accessed, modified, and saved with a rhythm that spoke of deep familiarity. Yet the pace felt somehow inhuman, too consistent and measured for normal human interaction patterns. The temperature in the office seemed to drop several degrees, though the building's climate control system hummed along at its usual volume. I found myself pulling my sweater more tightly around my shoulders as I continued to monitor the mysterious computer activity, torn between curiosity and a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite articulate. Something fundamental felt wrong about the situation, beyond the simple question of unauthorized access or unusual working hours. Then I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. In the reflection on Sarah's monitor, that faint mirror image created by the screen surface, I could make out the suggestion of a figure seated in her chair. The reflection was dim and distorted, more impression than clear image, but it conveyed the unmistakable outline of someone hunched over the keyboard in a posture of intense concentration. The shape was wrong, though, lacking the natural proportions I expected to see. Where a person's head should have been, there was only a smooth, undefined curve, as though someone had carefully erased the features while leaving the general outline intact. The reflection showed shoulders, arms, hands that moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, but above them sat only an empty space where a face should have resided. I blinked hard, certain that fatigue was causing me to misinterpret shadows and reflections, but when I looked again, the faceless figure remained, typing steadily at Sarah's workstation. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, though I couldn't decide who I should call or how I would explain what I was witnessing. The security desk downstairs? The police? Sarah herself? The longer I watched, the more convinced I became that I was observing something that existed outside the boundaries of rational explanation, something that my tired mind was struggling to process within familiar frameworks. The faceless figure continued its work with unwavering dedication, occasionally pausing to scroll through documents or navigate between applications, but never turning toward my location or acknowledging my presence in any way. Its movements had an eerily mechanical quality, precise and efficient, but somehow lacking the subtle irregularities that characterized normal human behavior. I sat transfixed, afraid to move or make any sound that might draw its attention, watching as it methodically worked through what appeared to be Sarah's daily tasks. Next story: the passenger who came home. It was supposed to be just another late-night drive home from the mountains, the kind of quiet journey my wife Sarah and I had taken dozens of times before. We'd spent the weekend at her sister's cabin, 3 hours north of our suburban neighborhood, and the October air had turned crisp enough that we'd packed up a day early. The winding highway stretched ahead of us in the darkness, illuminated only by our headlights cutting through the misty evening. Sarah dozed in the passenger seat while I navigated the familiar curves, classic rock playing softly from the radio to keep me alert during the long drive home. That's when we saw him standing beside the road, thumb extended in the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride. He appeared suddenly in our headlights near mile marker 47, a tall figure in a dark coat with a worn duffel bag at his feet. Something about the scene struck me as odd immediately. We were miles from any town or gas station, with nothing but dense forest on both sides of the highway. There was no broken-down vehicle visible, no explanation for how he'd ended up stranded in such a remote location at nearly midnight on a Sunday evening. Sarah stirred as I began to slow down, blinking awake and following my gaze to the figure by the roadside. "Are you really going to pick him up?" she asked, her voice carrying that mixture of concern and resignation that comes with 30 years of marriage. I'd always been the type to help strangers, much to her occasional worry, but something about this particular situation made even me hesitate. Still, the thought of leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere on such a cold night didn't sit right with me. So I pulled over to the shoulder and rolled down my window as the man approached our car. He moved with an unhurried gait, as if he'd been expecting us to stop all along. When he reached my window, I got my first clear look at his face in the dome light. He appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and weathered features that suggested a life spent mostly outdoors. His clothes were neat but well worn, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that immediately put me somewhat at ease. What struck me most were his eyes, which seemed almost familiar somehow, though I was certain we'd never met before. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "I don't suppose you're heading toward Millbrook." The question sent a small chill down my spine, because Millbrook was exactly where we were going. It wasn't a large town, and asking for that specific destination on this particular stretch of highway seemed like quite a coincidence. When I confirmed that yes, we lived in Millbrook, he smiled warmly and asked if he might trouble us for a ride. Something in his manner was so polite and unassuming that my earlier hesitation began to fade. Sarah and I exchanged a quick glance, and she gave me the slight nod that meant she was okay with helping him. We cleared some space in the back seat, and our passenger settled in with his duffel bag, thanking us again for our kindness. As we pulled back onto the highway, he introduced himself simply as David and explained that his car had broken down earlier that evening. A friend was supposed to pick him up, he said, but had never shown up. The story seemed reasonable enough, though it didn't quite explain why we hadn't seen any disabled vehicle along the roadside. The conversation that followed started normally enough, with the usual small talk that occurs between strangers sharing a car ride. David asked about our weekend, and we told him about visiting family in the mountains. He mentioned that he'd been visiting relatives as well, though he was vague about the details. What gradually began to unnerve me were the things he knew about our town that seemed oddly specific for someone who claimed to be just passing through the area. When Sarah mentioned that we'd stopped for dinner at Romano's before leaving town, David immediately knew exactly which restaurant she meant, describing its location and even commenting on how good their tiramisu was. When I mentioned taking a shortcut through the old industrial district earlier that day, he knew precisely which route I was referring to and warned me about construction that was supposedly starting there the following week. Each piece of local knowledge could have been explained away individually, but together they formed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. As we drove deeper into the night, David's questions became more personal and oddly specific. He asked if we still lived on Maple Street, which made my hands tighten on the steering wheel because we did indeed live on Maple Street. When I asked how he could possibly know that, he chuckled and said he must have confused us with someone else, though his tone suggested otherwise. He then asked if our daughter Jennifer was still teaching in Portland, which sent ice water through my veins because Jennifer was our daughter, and she was indeed a teacher in Portland, though she'd only recently moved there and we'd told almost no one about her new job. Sarah had gone very quiet beside me, and I could sense her growing tension. David seemed to pick up on our discomfort and apologized if he'd said something wrong, explaining that he was often told he had a good memory for faces and details. But his explanation only made things worse because he'd never said he recognized us before, and we certainly had never met him previously. The conversation died away after that, leaving us with only the sound of tires on asphalt and the increasingly oppressive feeling that something was terribly wrong with our helpful passenger. The remaining miles to Millbrook passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by David's occasional directions that proved he knew the roads better than someone just passing through should have. When we reached the town limits, I fully expected him to ask to be dropped off at a motel or gas station, but instead he began giving me turn-by-turn directions to what I gradually realized was our own neighborhood. My mouth went dry as he guided me down the exact streets I drove every day coming home from work. "You can drop me off right here," David said as we turned onto Maple Street, indicating a spot just 2 houses down from our own driveway. As I pulled over, my mind was racing with questions and fears I couldn't quite articulate. How did this stranger know where we lived? Why had he been waiting on that remote stretch of highway at exactly the right time to intercept us? And most terrifyingly, what did he want with us that required getting us to bring him directly to our home? David gathered his duffel bag and thanked us again for the ride, his manner still polite and unassuming despite the impossible knowledge he'd displayed throughout the journey. As he stepped out of our car, he paused and looked back at us through the open door. "You folks have a beautiful home," he said, nodding toward our house. "I especially like what you've done with the garden. Your wife has quite a talent for roses." Sarah gripped my arm tightly, because the rose garden was her pride and joy, visible only from our backyard and completely hidden from the street view where we were currently parked. We watched in stunned silence as David walked away into the darkness, disappearing between 2 houses as if he'd lived in the neighborhood his entire life. For several minutes we sat in our car outside our own home, afraid to get out and go inside. Finally, Sarah found her voice and whispered the question that was haunting both of us. How did he know about the roses? I had no answer for her, just as I had no explanation for anything else David had somehow known about our family and our lives. That night, we checked and double-checked every lock on our doors and windows before going to bed, though sleep was impossible. We kept expecting to see David's face at a window or hear him trying to enter our home, but the night passed without incident. In the morning, I called the police to report the strange encounter, but there was little they could do beyond taking a statement and promising to increase patrols in our neighborhood. The officer who took our report seemed skeptical about the whole story, and I couldn't really blame him. We never saw David again after that night, but his presence continues to haunt our lives in ways both subtle and profound. Every time we drive that mountain highway, we watch nervously for figures by the roadside, though none have appeared. We've never again picked up a hitchhiker and probably never will. Most unsettling of all, we can't shake the feeling that David is still out there somewhere, watching and waiting with his impossible knowledge of our private lives. Sometimes when Sarah is tending her roses in the backyard, she'll suddenly look up toward the woods behind our house, as if she can feel eyes observing her from the shadows. And late at night, when the house settles and creaks around us, we both find ourselves wondering if that helpful stranger, who knew exactly where we lived, might someday decide to come home. Next story, the messages that cross over. My childhood friend Marcus died in a car accident 3 years ago, but his phone number keeps texting me like he never left this world at all. I know this sounds impossible, and I've spent countless sleepless nights trying to rationalize what's been happening, but the evidence sits right there in my phone, glowing back at me with each new message that arrives from a number that should have been disconnected long ago. Marcus and I grew up on the same street in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. We built forts in the woods behind our houses, traded comic books, and spent entire summers riding our bikes to the local convenience store for slushies and candy bars. He was the kind of friend you assume you'll know forever, the kind who becomes part of your family without anyone officially making that decision. When we graduated high school, we promised to stay in touch even though we were heading to different colleges. Him to study engineering 3 states away, and me to stay local for business school. The accident happened during his junior year, right before Christmas break. He was driving home through a snowstorm when his car hit a patch of black ice and slid off the highway into a tree. The funeral was held on a gray December morning that felt appropriate for saying goodbye to someone who had always been full of light and laughter. I remember standing at his grave, watching his parents cry and feeling like a piece of my childhood had been buried right along with him. His phone, according to his mother, had been destroyed in the crash, crushed beyond any hope of recovery. For months afterward, I would sometimes catch myself reaching for my phone to text him about something funny I'd seen, or to share a memory from our past. That phantom urge to connect with someone who was no longer there became a strange kind of grief all its own. The first few times I accidentally started typing his name in my contacts, I would stop myself and delete the message, reminded once again that he was gone. His number remained in my phone like a memorial, something I couldn't bring myself to delete even though it served no purpose anymore. The first message came on a Tuesday evening in late spring, almost 6 months after the funeral. I was sitting in my apartment working on a presentation for my marketing class when my phone buzzed with a text notification. The name on the screen made my blood run cold because it simply read Marcus, followed by his old number. The message itself was innocuous enough, just 3 words that could have been sent by mistake or as some kind of cruel prank. It said, "Hey, what's up?" Exactly the way Marcus used to greet me whenever he wanted to hang out or catch up on life. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had to be playing a horrible joke on me, maybe using some kind of app or service that could mask phone numbers. I called his parents immediately, my voice trembling as I asked if they had given anyone access to Marcus's old number, or if the phone company had reassigned it to someone else. His mother's voice broke a little as she explained that the account had been canceled months ago, and that his phone number should have been retired permanently. She asked me to forward her the message, which I did, and she confirmed that it was indeed from the number that used to belong to her son. I decided not to respond to that first message, hoping that whoever was responsible for the prank would grow bored and move on to tormenting someone else. But 3 days later, another message appeared, this one slightly longer and more specific. It read, "Remember when we built that treehouse behind your garage? I was just thinking about that." The detail was unsettling because the treehouse had been a project we worked on during the summer between 7th and 8th grade, something we had barely talked about since then, and certainly not something I had ever posted about on social media or shared with many other people. As weeks passed, the messages continued to arrive with no discernible pattern, sometimes days apart, sometimes with weeks of silence in between. They were always written in Marcus's conversational style, referencing shared experiences and inside jokes that only he would have known about. One message mentioned the time we got lost in the woods during a camping trip and had to follow a stream back to civilization. Another brought up the name of our middle school math teacher, who used to assign impossible homework problems that we would struggle through together over the phone each night. The most disturbing aspect of these messages wasn't their frequency or even their impossible origin, but rather how they seemed to respond to events in my current life, despite my never replying to any of them. When I got accepted into a graduate program that I had been nervous about, a message appeared that said, "Congratulations on the grad school thing. I always knew you were smarter than you gave yourself credit for." When my grandmother passed away last fall, my phone buzzed with a message that simply read, "I'm sorry about your grandma. She always made the best chocolate chip cookies." I began to document every message, taking screenshots and noting the exact time and date of each one. I researched everything I could find about phone numbers being reassigned. About digital communication after death, about the possibility that someone could be monitoring my life closely enough to send these eerily accurate responses to my personal situations. Nothing I found provided a rational explanation for what was happening, and the technical impossibility of receiving messages from a disconnected, destroyed phone only deepened my sense of unease. The messages began to evolve over time, becoming less focused on shared memories and more concerned with my present circumstances. Marcus, or whatever was sending these messages using his identity, started asking questions about my daily routine, my relationships, my plans for the future.
How's that girl you've been dating?
Came one message, even though I had never mentioned Sarah to anyone who might have known Marcus. You seem stressed about work lately. Is everything okay? Arrived during a particularly difficult week when I was considering changing jobs. What frightened me most was the gradual realization that these messages weren't just randomly appearing, but seemed to be part of an ongoing conversation that only one side could hear. The entity behind Marcus's number appeared to be responding to thoughts and conversations that existed only in my head, as if some invisible barrier between the living and the dead had become permeable enough to allow this strange form of communication to continue. The messages never demanded responses, never seemed frustrated by my silence, but simply continued as if Marcus was still alive, and we were maintaining the same casual friendship we had always shared. Last month, the messages took on a new quality that filled me with a dread I struggled to articulate. Instead of referencing the past or commenting on my present, they began to hint at future events with an accuracy that defied explanation. "You should call your mom tomorrow," appeared on a Wednesday evening. And when I reluctantly made the call, I discovered that she had been feeling unwell and was grateful for the check-in. "Take a different route to work on Friday," came with no explanation, and though I almost ignored the advice, I ultimately decided to try a new path, and later learned that a serious accident had blocked my usual commute for several hours. The most recent message arrived just 3 days ago, and its contents have left me questioning everything I thought I understood about life, death, and the possibility of connection beyond the grave. It was longer than usual, written with a gentleness that reminded me so powerfully of my old friend that I nearly broke down reading it. "I know this is confusing and probably scary for you," it began, "but I want you to know that I'm okay wherever I am. Death isn't the end of caring about people, and some bonds are strong enough to reach across whatever separates us now. I can't explain how this works, only that it does, and that friendship like ours doesn't just disappear because one person's body stops working. You don't have to reply to these messages, but I hope they bring you some comfort instead of fear. I miss you too." Tonight, as I sit here staring at my phone, I find myself finally ready to type a response, to bridge the impossible gap between the living and the dead with nothing more than words on a screen. My fingers hover over the keyboard, trembling with the weight of trying to communicate with someone who should no longer exist, yet somehow still cares enough to reach out from whatever lies beyond our understanding of mortality itself. Next story. The Rest Stop Confession. The interstate stretched endlessly before me that October night, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness of rural Montana. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight, my eyes burning from the strain of watching for deer and my back aching from the rigid posture I maintained whenever exhaustion threatened to creep in. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m. when I finally spotted the blue highway sign announcing a rest stop in 2 miles. Relief flooded through me like cool water, and I signaled right even though there hadn't been another car on the road for the past hour. The rest stop materialized from the shadows like something forgotten by time itself. It was one of those old concrete block buildings from the 70s, squatting beneath a handful of sodium lights that cast everything in an amber glow. The parking lot was empty except for my sedan, which seemed almost unnaturally small against the vast expanse of cracked pavement. I sat in my car for a moment after turning off the engine, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant whisper of wind through the pine trees that crowded the edges of the facility. Something about the place felt suspended, as if it existed in a pocket outside normal time where travelers paused briefly before disappearing back into their journeys. The main building housed the restrooms and a small visitor information center that had clearly been locked for hours. Vending machines hummed against one wall, their displays flickering occasionally and casting brief shadows that danced across the concrete. I gathered my phone and wallet, though I noticed I had no cell service out here, and walked toward the men's restroom. My footsteps echoed strangely in the open air, seeming to bounce off invisible walls and return to me altered somehow. The sound made me realize just how complete the silence was in this place, broken only by the electrical buzz of the lights overhead and the occasional ping of the building settling. Inside the restroom, fluorescent tubes cast harsh white light that made everything appear bleached and sterile. The space was larger than I expected, with a row of sinks along one wall and several stalls extending deeper into the room. Everything looked recently cleaned, which surprised me given the isolated location and late hour. The smell of industrial disinfectant hung heavy in the air, mixing with something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and faintly sweet that seemed to emanate from the drain systems. I approached the nearest sink, grateful for the opportunity to splash cold water on my face and wake myself up for the remaining hours of driving ahead. As I bent over the sink, cupping water in my palms, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror above the faucet. My hands froze, water dripping between my fingers as I stared at the reflection. There, beneath the row of sinks behind me, I could see a pair of shoes. Not just shoes, but legs bent at an uncomfortable angle, as if someone was crouching in that impossibly narrow space between the sink pedestals and the wall. The person was completely motionless, and I found myself holding my breath as I tried to process what I was seeing. The shoes were simple black sneakers, worn but not old, and above them I could make out the hem of dark pants. I turned around slowly, water still dripping from my chin, but from this angle I couldn't see beneath the sinks clearly. The pedestals blocked my view, and the harsh fluorescent lighting created shadows that seemed to shift and move. I called out a tentative hello, my voice sounding small and strange in the tiled space. There was no response, not even the slight rustle of fabric or creak of joints that you might expect from someone maintaining such an awkward position. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, filled with implications I didn't want to consider. Moving closer to the row of sinks, I crouched down and tried to peer beneath them. The space was deeper than it appeared from my original position, extending back toward a maintenance area I hadn't noticed before. In that shadowy recess, I could definitely see someone huddled against the wall. They were facing away from me, their dark clothing making them almost invisible in the gloom. Their posture was wrong somehow, too rigid and angular, as if they were holding themselves in a position that no human body should comfortably maintain. I could see the back of their head now, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I spoke again, louder this time, asking if they were all right or if they needed help. The words echoed off the tiles and seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Still no response, no acknowledgement that they had heard me at all. A cold feeling began to spread through my chest as I realized that in all the time I had been watching, I hadn't seen them move even slightly. No shift in weight, no adjustment of position, no sign of breathing or any other involuntary movement that would indicate a living person. Yet something about their stillness felt deliberate rather than lifeless, as if they were actively choosing not to move rather than being unable to do so. I stood up and backed away from the sinks, my heart beginning to race despite my attempts to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was a homeless person seeking shelter, though this seemed like an odd place to hide. Maybe they were afraid of me, unsure of my intentions and waiting for me to leave before emerging from their hiding spot. But even as I tried to convince myself of these logical explanations, Something deeper and more primitive in my brain was screaming warnings. The wrongness of the person's position, the absolute stillness, the way they seemed to blend with the shadows as if they belonged there, all combined to create a sense of dread that grew stronger with each passing moment. I decided to leave the restroom and give them space, thinking that perhaps my presence was preventing them from moving freely. Outside, the parking lot felt even more isolated than before, and I noticed that the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else that reminded me of old basements and forgotten places. I walked to my car but didn't get in immediately. Instead, I leaned against the hood and watched the restroom entrance, thinking that surely the person would emerge now that they believed they were alone again. Minutes passed, marked only by the swaying of the pine trees and the occasional flicker of the sodium lights overhead. A maintenance truck pulled into the parking lot, its diesel engine chugging loudly in the stillness. The driver was an older man in a work uniform, and he nodded to me as he climbed out with a toolbox and a set of keys. I approached him, grateful for another human presence in this strange place, and mentioned that someone was hiding in the men's restroom. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern, asking me to describe what I had seen. When I finished, he shook his head slowly and explained that he was here because the motion sensors in the restroom had been malfunctioning for weeks, triggering at random times throughout the night, even when the facility was completely empty. He invited me to accompany him back inside, and together we entered the harsh fluorescent lighting of the restroom. The maintenance worker moved directly to the row of sinks and knelt down, shining a powerful flashlight into the space beneath them. The beam revealed nothing but concrete walls, exposed pipes, and a few patches of mineral stains where water had leaked over the years. The space was far shallower than it had appeared to me earlier, certainly not deep enough for a person to hide in the position I had witnessed. He explained that the motion sensors were located in that area, installed during a renovation years ago, and that something in the electrical system was causing them to activate randomly. As he worked on the sensors, adjusting connections and testing circuits, I found myself staring at the spot where I had seen the crouching figure. The maintenance worker's explanation made perfect sense from a technical standpoint, but it didn't account for the vivid detail of what I had observed. I could still see those black sneakers in my mind, still remember the unnatural angles of the person's posture, and the way their hair seemed to absorb light. When the worker finished his repairs and we left the restroom together, I thanked him for his time but couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been left unresolved. Driving away from the rest stop, I checked my mirrors repeatedly until the amber lights disappeared behind a curve in the road. The remaining hours of my journey passed without incident, but I found myself thinking about that crouching figure and wondering if some places collect the echoes of all the people who pass through them. Perhaps in locations where thousands of travelers pause briefly before continuing their journeys, something accumulates in the spaces between the walls, a residue of human presence that occasionally becomes visible to those who happen to look at just the right moment. The motion sensors, I realized, might not have been malfunctioning at all, but responding to something that exists just beyond the normal boundaries of perception, something that crouches in the shadows waiting to be acknowledged by the occasional traveler who stops long enough to really see.